Hi guys. Tonight, we're beginning a gentle journey into a lesser-known, sometimes haunting, yet deeply human story. One that's wound through time like a quiet current beneath the louder narratives of history. It's about how women's anxiety, that fluttering, constricting, often invisible weight, has been misunderstood, mislabeled, and mistreated through the centuries. This tale begins far before Freud's fainting couches or 1950s housewives with pills in their handbags. It begins in the silence of ancient temples and the uneasy corners of medieval convents. This is not a story about just science or medicine or psychology. It's about perception. It's about fear, control, misunderstanding, and at times compassion too. Through 24 parts, we'll trace how society viewed women's minds when they began to tremble. We'll hear stories of real women whose voices were lost and sometimes found again, and we'll follow the thread of one question. What happens when a woman's suffering is too quiet to hear and too misunderstood to soothe? Let's begin. Slowly, softly. Let your thoughts drift like candle smoke. Long before diagnoses and textbooks, before anxiety was a word anyone understood, there were whispers of something unquiet within the bodies of women. In ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before the birth of Christ, clay tablets written in cuneiform offered clues. Priests and healers of the time believed in spirits, not just gods that ruled the skies, but spirits that slipped into bodies. If a woman became restless, if she trembled or cried or fainted, it was not understood as a sickness. It was possession. They called it zikarudu, a condition only affecting women. And though the symptoms were vague, they painted a picture familiar even now. A woman who could not sleep, who cried without cause, who heard voices no one else could hear. Her hands would shake, her heart might race, her moods would swing like a desert wind. But rather than comfort her, they summoned ritual. A high priest might lead her to a sacred temple, burn incense made of cedar and cypress, chant long syllables meant to drive the spirit away. She would drink bitter brews of unknown herbs, sometimes made from the gall of oxen or the root of mandrake, which would make her body weak. There was no sympathy, only purification. The spirit had to be punished, not the woman. And yet, even in those early records, there are glimmers of something more human. Some clay tablets hint that these rituals weren't always cruel. The temple priestesses, women themselves, sometimes whispered sacred prayers meant to bring peace. They anointed the forehead with oils. They sang. For some, the temple was not a place of punishment, but the only space where their trembling was seen at all. In ancient Egypt, a new story unfurled. Here, the anxiety of women was seen not as a spirit, but as a wayward womb. Yes, the womb, the hustera, as the Greeks would later call it. Egyptian medicine believed that a woman's uterus could move around inside her body like a restless creature. If a woman grew nervous or sad or breathless, it was because her womb had wandered up toward her chest, choking her heart. So doctors treated her with scents. They placed sweet perfumes near her genitals to lure the womb back down, and pungent, sharp smells near her nose to drive it away from the head. They massaged her belly, burned herbs beside her, and recited spells calling the womb to settle. It sounds almost absurd now, but beneath the myth there is something tender, an attempt to soothe, to coax rather than conquer. These women, so easily dismissed as hysterical or possessed, were at least given a ritual of care. Then came the Greeks. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, inherited this idea of the wandering womb, but he added more structure. He believed women's bodies were damp, full of fluids, and that this made them vulnerable to imbalance. Too much cold and they became listless, too much heat and they became frantic. Anxiety, in this system, was not an emotional experience. It was a physical dysfunction of feminine biology. Women's minds, they thought, were governed by their bodies, ruled by their cycles, their sex, their softness. So when a woman trembled or cried, Hippocrates suggested sex or marriage as a remedy. A husband would ground her, a child would calm her. This logic stretched far beyond Greece. In Rome, it was said that an unmarried woman could grow ill from longing. Her anxiety, they believed, was her womb crying out for fulfillment. So Roman doctors prescribed scented oils, warm baths, and, of course, submission to her role. Marriage, motherhood. These were seen not just as life paths, but medical prescriptions. For women of status, there was some mercy. Wealthy Roman women could retreat to the countryside, stay in cool marble rooms, sip wine infused with poppy. They were allowed to rest. But poor women, slaves, peasants, had no such luxury. Their trembling was weakness, their panic madness. The most haunting part is this. No one asked what the woman felt, not really. Her words, if written at all, came filtered through the quill of a man. Her pain was a puzzle for others to solve, a symbol to interpret, never a voice to be heard. Still, not all was cruelty. In certain shrines across Greece, especially those dedicated to Asclepius, god of healing, women could sleep in sacred chambers called abaton. There, they believed dreams carried messages from the divine. If a woman dreamt of fire, it meant her spirit was unsettled. If she saw water, it meant healing was near. In those dark, perfumed rooms, sometimes anxiety was treated not as an illness, but as a message. A sign, a secret to listen to. As we float gently out of this ancient world, the patterns are already forming. Women's suffering was real, but so often misnamed. Their tremors and fears were twisted into myth, medicalized as biology, or blamed on demons. Their anxiety was not a feeling, but a symbol for others to decode. In the next chapter, we'll enter the hushed stone corridors of medieval Europe, where saints wept and screamed, where female suffering was either holiness or heresy, and where the lines between divine ecstasy and mental torment blurred into something far more haunting. Just breathe now. Let the silence settle. When you're ready for more, the next part awaits. The stone corridors of medieval Europe echoed with soft footsteps and whispered prayers. Candlelight flickered against moss-darkened walls, casting long shadows across the faces of women kneeling in silence. Here, in the twilight between ancient ritual and modern science, women's anxiety wore a different name. Not possession or imbalance, but sanctity or sin. In this world, the line between holiness and madness was razor-thin. A trembling woman might be called a saint or a heretic. And sometimes she was both. Let us drift to a small convent in 13th century Germany. The bells chime softly as nuns move like pale ghosts through the chapel, their veils brushing against polished stone. Among them is a woman whose name we remember even now, Hildegard of Bingen. Visionary, composer, mystic, and perhaps one of the earliest recorded women to describe what we might today call anxiety. She wrote of light that pierced her skull like fire, of tremors in her body, of breathlessness and fear that came without warning. But Hildegard didn't call this madness. She called it divine revelation. The church, hesitant but intrigued, eventually agreed. Her visions became doctrine, her writings sacred. But Hildegard was rare. For most women in the Middle Ages, to shake or scream or cry without cause was not proof of divinity. It was evidence of darkness. You see, this was the age of spirits still, but they had taken on new names. The devil, his demons, the temptations of Eve. A woman who cried in her sleep might be said to be visited by Satan. One who fainted during Mass, even from hunger, could be accused of resisting the holy presence of God. Anxiety was not seen as illness, but as spiritual weakness. And the treatments? They were harsh. Confession, fasting, whipping, not to punish the body, but to cleanse the soul. The body was a vessel, and if that vessel trembled, it must be made still through submission. In one small village near what is now Belgium, a young girl of just 16 was reported to have visions and fits. She screamed at night. She tore at her clothes. Her family feared madness. The local priest declared her touched by Satan and ordered her bound and left in a church cell. But an older nun, wise and quiet, began to visit her. She brought soft bread, whispered psalms, held the girl's hand until the shaking passed. The girl's fits eased over time. Not because the devil had been driven out, but because someone finally sat beside her without fear. This is not written in grand books of theology. It's found in a faded parish note, preserved in a monastery's archives, a flicker of humanity barely remembered. During these centuries, something else quietly unfolded. Medicine, such as it was, began to reassert itself. The ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates were copied in Latin and returned to Europe through contact with the Islamic world. Physicians, many trained in universities for the first time, began to speak again of the womb, of humours of imbalance. But these doctors were men, and their patients were usually men as well. When they turned their gaze toward women, it was with distance. The term hysteria began to take hold, from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. a disorder of the female body that explained everything from anxiety to seizures to sadness. So when a woman wept too often or refused her chores or wandered the streets speaking nonsense, a diagnosis might come: hysteria. The treatment? Leeching, bleeding, purgatives, or worse, forced silence. One particularly cruel account comes from 14th century France. A young noblewoman, described as melancholic, began pacing at night. She wrote strange verses in the margins of her Bible, claimed to feel watched even when alone. A physician declared her womb in rebellion and prescribed isolation, cold compresses, and sexual congress with her husband. When that failed, he ordered that she be confined to her chambers and given no books, no writing tools. Her verses were never finished. Her final entry, carved with a pin into the wooden frame of her bed, read only, "I am still here." The church and the early physicians danced around one another in this period. Sometimes they clashed, sometimes they merged. In the lives of ordinary women it meant confusion. Was her fear a sickness, a sin, or a calling? For some, that ambiguity was power. Visionary women, those who claimed ecstatic experience, spoke to angels, wept for hours in the presence of icons, were revered in some regions. Saints like Catherine of Siena or Marjorie Kempe defied male expectations. Catherine starved herself into spiritual ecstasy. Marjorie wept uncontrollably for hours, describing the fire of Christ burning in her chest. Today, many psychologists believe these women suffered from anxiety, depression, or trauma. But in their time, they were holy, until they weren't. Marjorie, especially, walked the tightrope. Though she wrote the first known autobiography in English, a remarkable feat, she was also dragged before bishops, accused of heresy, mocked for her fits and cries. Her anxiety was mistaken for pride, her visions for lies, but she never recanted. Her words remain. For women without the protection of piety, the story was darker still. The late medieval period saw the beginning of witch trials, a grim transformation in how female emotion was perceived. A woman who wailed in grief after the death of her child, who wandered the woods alone, who brewed herbs and whispered to herself, she became suspect. What we would now call a panic attack, they might call bewitchment. A sudden spell of dread, of faintness, of choking sobs, surely the work of a curse. And who then must have cast it? Another woman, perhaps the one with trembling hands. In these years, women turned inward. They swallowed their fears. They prayed harder. Or they learned to hide. The trembling, the breathlessness, the insomnias, they were endured in silence, lest the world outside interpret them as guilt. And yet, some found solace. In sisterhood, in the hush of cloisters, in the act of writing or weaving or lighting a candle just before dawn. Their anxiety, unnamed, became woven into their faith. They offered it to God like incense. But the ground was shifting, slowly. As Europe emerged into the Renaissance, the mind would begin to matter in new ways. Emotion, intellect, inner life, these ideas stirred in the writings of scholars and poets. And in the quiet chambers of apothecaries and early physicians, new questions would begin to bloom. What is the mind? Can it suffer apart from the body? Can women's fears be understood, not punished? In the next chapter, we'll cross that threshold, into a time of rebirth and inquiry, a time when anxiety would become, for the first time, something to observe, something to name, something to study, if not yet to understand. The Renaissance brought with it a trembling kind of light, one that spilled slowly through the cracks in centuries-old stone. Cities began to awaken, art blossomed, anatomy was studied, and the human body, once feared, once sacred, was dissected, sketched, examined with wonder and ambition. Amidst this swelling tide of curiosity, the female mind began to take on a new kind of scrutiny. It was no longer just a vessel for sin or sanctity. Now it was something to question, to theorize about, even to doubt. But the Renaissance, for all its glories, was not a gentle time for women. Though the brushstrokes of Botticelli and Da Vinci captured their forms in beauty and softness, the minds behind those faces remained a mystery, or worse, a threat. Anxiety, still unnamed, still misunderstood, found itself bound again in layers of art, science, and silence. Let us wander now through a candlelit study in Florence around the year 1503. A physician named Girolamo Mercuriale sits surrounded by scrolls and herbs. He has written extensively on diseases of the body, and now with growing interest, he pens theories on illness of the soul. He does not call it anxiety, he calls it melancholia, This melancholia, he believes, is the result of black bile, one of the 4 humours that govern human temperament. Too much black bile, and a person grows fearful, withdrawn, weepy. Women, Mercuriali suggests, are particularly prone to it. Their bodies are colder, their humours more easily stirred. He writes of a patient who wept for hours each morning, her heart racing with dread. He prescribes music, soft baths, and the company of kind friends. For a moment, there is a gentleness in his methods. But then, he adds, if she does not improve, she should be purged. Melancholia was not yet a medical condition in the modern sense. It was a flavour of being, a poetic temperament, often associated with artists, writers, philosophers. A melancholic man might be called brilliant, introspective, tragic, a melancholic woman, unstable, dangerous, possibly in need of confinement. Still, in the courts of Europe, noble women suffered quietly behind silk and lace. Letters from the era, especially those between women, reveal fragile threads of confession. One Italian countess wrote to her sister of the ghost that grips my chest before the sun rises, and of the silent tremors that shake my hands before a gathering. In another letter from England, a young lady in waiting writes, "There are nights I cannot breathe, and no prayers will settle me. I fear I shall go mad if I do not scream, but I do not scream. I smile instead." These were the quiet sufferings of status, wrapped in etiquette, hidden behind the fan and the corset. Women were expected to be composed, pleasing, pleasant. Fear had no place in the drawing room. But outside the courts, in the growing cities of Europe, new spaces were forming. Coffee houses, salons, and most importantly, apothecaries. Shelves lined with glass bottles, fragrant powders, roots, and dried flowers. Here, women came in secret, not to confess sin, but to seek relief. Anxiety still had no name, but its shape was familiar. It was sleeplessness, stomach pains, fainting fits, breathlessness, sobbing without cause. The apothecaries had remedies. Lemon balm for calming nerves, valerian root steeped in wine, lavender in warm compresses, a bit of opium perhaps mixed with honey. These were gentle treatments, but not cures. They soothed the symptoms, never touching the source. No one asked why the women trembled. No one considered that the world itself, rigid, judgmental, punishing, might be the cause. And then, across the English Channel, a new figure emerged, one who would alter the course of understanding, though not always for the better. His name was Robert Burton. In 1621, he published The Anatomy of Melancholy, a sprawling, deeply philosophical text that tried to catalogue every possible cause and treatment for what we might now call depression and anxiety. Burton wrote with empathy and with sadness. He spoke of fear without cause, of trembling of the heart, of women who are gripped by sorrow and cannot say why. He believed the mind could sicken, just as the body could. That thoughts could become poisoned, that the soul could ache. But he too fell back on old ideas. Women, he said, were more likely to suffer because they were more tender, more governed by their wombs, more easily disturbed. He suggested reading, gentle music and prayer, but also leeches, purging and marriage. Always marriage. It's strange, isn't it? How often in history marriage was prescribed not as a life choice, but as a remedy. For melancholy, for hysteria, for spiritual imbalance. A woman's fear, it was believed, could be stilled by the presence of a man. In truth, many women found the opposite. In the rare memoirs that survive, often hidden, unpublished, or shared in small circles, women speak of dread that grew after marriage, a sense of being watched, judged, controlled. One anonymous diary from 17th century France contains the line, "He does not hit me, but I feel fear all the same. It moves beneath my skin." By the late Renaissance, the stage was set for something new. Physicians had returned once more to the womb as a site of female madness. The term hysteria gained momentum, now defined less as a wandering uterus and more as a psychological condition believed to originate in the reproductive organs. And so the treatments became more invasive. Midwives were instructed to perform internal massages. Doctors prescribed intercourse as a corrective, with or without the woman's consent. And in elite circles, mechanical devices were sometimes used, not for pleasure, but to calm what was seen as a dangerous surge of nervous energy. What was anxiety then? To these men of medicine and authority, it was a disturbance of the feminine, a kind of static that had to be smoothed away. It could not be voiced, only silenced. But in the private world of women, through letters, lullabies, shared recipes for calming teas, a different understanding persisted. Women knew that their fear was real, that their hearts beat faster in certain rooms, that sleep fled them for no reason, that some days their thoughts spiraled into shadows they could not name. They did not call it anxiety, but they lived with it. They passed down their knowledge, through touch, through words, through careful silences. And even as science marched forward, the quiet suffering continued. The next century would bring revolutions of all kinds, political, industrial, and intellectual. And with them, a new obsession would emerge, the nerves. In the age of enlightenment, the anxious woman would become not a saint or a sinner, but a patient, one to be studied, dissected, observed. We will follow her there, through parlours and padded cells, through salons and asylums. But for now, let us linger just a moment longer in this place of transition, where art met fear, and the trembling woman began to be seen, though still not quite understood. The 18th century arrived not with a roar, but with a rustle, of lace skirts over polished floors, of quills scratching on parchment, of wigs being powdered in rooms perfumed with lavender and civet. It was an age of order, of enlightenment, of candlelit rationality. And yet, beneath the starched elegance of the salons and lecture halls, something less orderly stirred. An invisible presence crept through the parlours and boudoirs of Europe, the nerves. The idea of nerves had existed, for centuries of course, but now they became fashionable, discussed in philosophical debates, mentioned in poetry, worried over at breakfast tables. Where once spirits or wombs had been blamed, now it was the nervous system that bore the burden of explanation. The brain and its delicate fibres, the body's electric whispers. And women, they said, were especially susceptible. Doctors and thinkers alike began to describe nervous disorders as uniquely feminine afflictions. These were not viewed as madness per se, nor as the hysteria of earlier centuries. No, the 18th century introduced a new archetype, the nervous woman. Delicate, cultured, often wealthy, her anxiety became a mark of refinement. She fainted in crowded rooms. She wept silently when moved by poetry. She developed vapours, a mysterious affliction believed to arise from stagnant bodily gases, but widely understood as a polite term for emotional distress. The treatment? A sniff of smelling salts, a glass of fortified wine, a retreat to the countryside. In truth, much of this was theatre. Elite society cloaked suffering in elegance, but beneath the silk gloves and fainting couches were real symptoms: racing hearts, breathlessness, chronic fatigue, insomnia, dread without cause. Anxiety, now shaped into fashion. Let us pause in London, sometime around 1742. The drawing room is warm with firelight. A woman named Lady Penelope has not slept in 3 nights. Her heart leaps at sudden sounds. Her skin feels too tight, but she is not mad. She is merely nervous. Her husband, a kindly but detached man, brings her tea and consults a physician. The doctor recommends rest, gentle conversation, and a tonic made from laudanum. Laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, was sold in ornate bottles, advertised as a cure for melancholy, nerves, cough, colic, and women's troubles. It was soothing, yes, but addictive. Penelope takes it nightly, and her tremors soften. But inside, the fear still grows. Outside the parlours of privilege, nervousness was treated with less delicacy. Working-class women, if they showed similar symptoms, were not seen as refined. They were seen as weak, unstable, even dangerous. A maid who grew pale and refused food might be dismissed. A washerwoman who spoke of dread might be sent to a hospital. And those hospitals, or as they were called then, madhouses, were multiplying. The most infamous, of course, was Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known by another name, Bedlam. Here, women with all manner of afflictions were housed together: epileptics, melancholics, the violently psychotic, and those simply overwhelmed by grief or anxiety. There was no clear diagnosis, no gentle separation of symptoms, just cells and silence and the occasional scream down the corridor. Treatment ranged from the benign to the cruel. Cold baths, isolation, sometimes chains, and yet some patients were visited by artists, philosophers, physicians. There were those who genuinely sought to understand, to document, to reform. One man, William Batty, became superintendent of St. Luke's Hospital, a rival to Bedlam. He wrote of women who suffered without visible cause, whose minds were in turmoil. He advocated for fresh air, conversation, even kindness, radical thoughts at the time. Still, the era's most powerful change came not in the wards, but on the page. The 18th century was a golden age of diaries, letters, and novels. And in those pages women began to write, not always freely, but more often than ever before, about their inner worlds. In the novels of Samuel Richardson, for example, heroines suffer from nerves. They faint at the sight of their oppressors. They pace the floor in dread. These tropes became common, part of the emotional landscape of fiction. But beyond fiction, in private letters, something truer emerges. One woman, writing to her sister in 1765, describes a dread that visits me upon waking, like a heavy fog pressing on my chest. I fear the day before it begins. I long for rest, yet when it comes, I cannot take it. Another writes, my hands will not still themselves. I try to sew, to pray, to write, but my body betrays me. I feel as though I might fly apart, like paper in fire. These words are not dramatic. They are intimate, real, and they echo centuries later in the mouths of women today. Meanwhile, across the sea in the new American colonies, nervousness followed women there too. Colonial doctors borrowed heavily from English practices. Herbalists used chamomile, lemon balm, and mugwort for female unease. Ministers preached against idleness, suggesting that too much solitude bred madness. But in these young towns, survival often took precedence over introspection. A woman with anxiety might be seen as lazy, unfit for the hardships of frontier life. Her fears would be brushed aside or hidden, and yet stories remain. A woman in Massachusetts, writing in 1771, recorded in her private journal, I fear to leave the house, for I am sure some evil will find me. I cannot explain this dread. My husband says it is womanish foolishness, but it feels real. I feel it in my stomach, in my hands, in my throat. There it is again. That shape. The invisible hand that tightens the chest, that silences the voice. By the end of the century, nervousness had become a category unto itself, especially for women. It was vaguely defined, widely accepted, and quietly endured, and the treatments grew stranger. Mechanical chairs that spun to rearrange the fluids, electric shocks applied to the spine, diets of raw eggs and cold milk. A woman might spend weeks in a country manor, walking under trees and avoiding any mention of distress, and always the whisper, don't speak of it. Still, the whispering women kept writing, in journals, in novels, in poems that spoke of hollow mornings and sleepless nights. Their words, some preserved, some lost, form a thread, delicate and trembling, stretching into the coming century. A century that would bring revolutions, railways, telegrams, and Freud. But before that, it would bring something else, the rise of the asylum as a permanent fixture, and with it, the next great chapter in the story of women's anxiety, not as fashion, not as melancholia, but as madness, or what the men of the 19th century preferred to call moral failure. The 19th century came wrapped in soot and steam, in the clatter of carriages and the distant thunder of machines. Cities grew louder, skies dimmed with coal smoke, and beneath the corseted waists and polished shoes of progress something quieter stirred, a deepening of silence around the minds of women. Anxiety by then had taken on many names, but in this new century it began to wear uniforms. It was diagnosed, catalogued, and confined. The modern asylum, vast, institutional, and permanent, became the final word for women whose emotions overflowed the narrow boundaries allowed them. Let us drift now to the wide gravel paths and barred windows of a typical English asylum in the 1850s. The walls are high and grey. The gardens are symmetrical. Inside, everything smells faintly of damp linen and chalk. A woman is led in. Her name is Elizabeth. She has been crying in church, refusing food, saying she feels watched. Her husband, wary of her melancholic episodes, signed the papers. She is here for her health, they say, for her nerves. But no one asks Elizabeth what she feels. Instead, they write, incoherent tendencies toward hysteria, aggravated by excessive emotion and reading of novels. She will remain here for months, or years, or perhaps until her death. The Victorian era, with all its intellectual achievements, clung tightly to rigid ideas about women. They were to be composed, graceful, devoted to home and husband. Emotion, if it leaked out, must do so in acceptable doses. A soft sigh, a modest tear. Anything more was dangerous. Doctors of the time believed that women's minds were weaker, more delicate, more susceptible to moral insanity, a term used not to describe criminal behavior but deviation from expected norms, to want too much, to question a role, to weep without cause. All this could be deemed a moral failing. And so, asylums filled with women who had strayed from the emotional script. Some were truly suffering, plagued by the terrifying storms of anxiety and despair, but others were simply inconvenient. Widows who mourned too long, wives who read too late into the night, daughters who spoke too boldly. There are records, hundreds of them, listing reasons for admittance. Imaginary female trouble, religious excitement, novel reading, nervous exhaustion, disappointment in love. These diagnoses were not acts of cruelty alone. They were the result of a society that could not bear women's suffering to exist outside of categories it understood. Inside the asylum, treatments were both clinical and symbolic. Women were bathed in ice water, strapped to chairs that spun, given electric shocks to the spine. They were made to scrub floors, recite prayers, maintain routines that would restore their so-called sanity. The idea was that order would breed order, that submission would heal the mind. But these places were not entirely devoid of compassion. Some reformers, like Dorothea Dix in America, fought to improve conditions. She believed that the mentally ill deserved dignity, kindness, fresh air, and in some institutions new ideas began to take root, that rest and beauty and calm could soothe the mind. One such experiment was the Kirkbride Plan, an architectural philosophy that proposed asylums be built with wide windows, open grounds and wings that spread like a butterfly. It was meant to bring peace, to heal. Yet even in these sunlit corridors, anxiety was still misunderstood. A woman pacing her room, clutching her chest, whispering of a dread she could not name, she was still seen as broken. Not troubled, not frightened, not human in pain, but broken. Outside the asylums, women's emotional lives continued under stricter and quieter constraints. The home became a sacred, suffocating space. Middle-class women, especially in England and America, were praised for their purity, their calmness, their restraint. They were the angels of the house. They bore children, managed servants, embroidered their quiet despair into lace. If a woman felt anxiety, a pounding heart, a shortness of breath, an unshakable fear, she might call it nerves. She would be told to rest, to avoid stimulation, to lie down in a dark room. Doctors sometimes recommended a diet of bland foods or the avoidance of music. But if the anxiety grew, if it began to intrude on her duties, if it made her weep too often or refuse conjugal obligations, the remedies changed. And among the most infamous was the rest cure. Developed by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, the rest cure was prescribed almost exclusively to women. It involved weeks, sometimes months, of total isolation. No reading, no writing, no visitors, no movement. The woman was confined to bed and spoon-fed milk and beef broth. The idea was that overstimulation caused mental illness, and total submission to rest would restore balance. One of its most famous recipients was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. After enduring the rest cure, she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling short story of a woman confined to a nursery, slowly unraveling into madness as she stares at the strange patterns on the wallpaper. She sees a woman trapped within the walls, crawling, trying to escape. The story was not fiction, it was prophecy. Gilman's tale exposed the quiet horror of being doubted, of having one's inner world dismissed, of being told again and again that the pain was imagined, that fear was weakness, that the solution was silence. And yet for many women, silence was survival. In diaries and private letters from the 19th century, anxiety is described in code. My heart behaves poorly today. The air feels weighted. I long for solitude, though I fear it. These are the phrases left behind, traces of the struggle to name what had no name. There were, of course, exceptions. A few women found outlets in literature, in activism, in private friendships. They wrote not always for publication, but for understanding. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, haunted by chronic illness and what we now suspect was severe anxiety, poured her suffering into poetry. Emily Dickinson, too, with her quiet dread and shattering insight, hid herself from the world and wrote of a soul's terror. And as the century turned toward its end, new voices began to rise. Feminists, doctors, poets, asking at last whether the trembling of women's hands might be something other than disease. Perhaps it was protest. Perhaps it was truth, but they were whispers still. Echoes in padded rooms. The 20th century would arrive with science and war and pills in its hands, but the shadow of the asylum would stretch long behind it. And the anxious woman, though she would now be studied, labelled, medicated, would still often find her voice muffled, her fear misunderstood. She was no longer a saint, nor a sinner, nor even always a patient. She was something new, and something very old. She was still afraid. The 20th century opened its doors with the promise of science. Electricity surged through cities, trains stitched countries together, voices crackled across radio waves. And with all this modernity came a new era of medicine. Precise, clinical, objective, or so it seemed. But for the anxious woman, the change was more subtle and sometimes more insidious. Her world no longer revolved around convents or asylums, but around clinics, hospitals, and waiting rooms with chairs lined in neat rows. She now had charts and files and diagnoses. She had pills. She had doctors, so many doctors, and yet her suffering was still, more often than not, misunderstood. Let us begin this chapter in Vienna, in a dimly lit office lined with books and couches. It is 1901. Sigmund Freud sits with a notebook balanced on one knee. His patient lies on the chaise behind him, unseen. She speaks softly, perhaps tearfully, about her mother, about a recurring dream, about a moment in childhood she had long forgotten. Freud listens. He believes anxiety has roots, deep ones, that it is the visible tip of an invisible past, repressed desire, childhood trauma, internal conflict between instinct and civility, and for women, often, the conflict of femininity itself. Freud's early work on hysteria was groundbreaking and deeply flawed. He suggested that many symptoms women displayed, including anxiety, were not caused by physical illness but by emotional repression. But he filtered all through a narrow lens: sexual development, repression, and the male psyche as the default. He believed women's minds were intricate but fragile, that they suffered because they could not reconcile their desires with societal expectations. His ideas gained traction across Europe and America, shaping psychology for decades. Yet many women who entered psychoanalysis found that instead of clarity, they were met with suspicion. A woman who trembled, who sobbed, who struggled to leave her home, she was not only sick but guilty. Guilty of repression. Guilty of not being able to adapt to her role as wife, mother, caretaker. The treatment was talk. The cure was confession. But always beneath it was the idea that something in her had failed. And in parallel, something else was happening. As cities grew and life accelerated, anxiety was no longer just a women's affliction. It was becoming part of the modern condition. Men returned from wars with shattered nerves, haunted by what they had seen. Shell shock, they called it. Later, combat fatigue, eventually post-traumatic stress. And for the first time, the language of trauma began to evolve. But women's suffering remained mostly confined to quieter places: kitchens, bedrooms, doctors' offices where they were told to rest, to breathe, to try harder. In 1950s America, the anxious woman became almost a cliché. She wore pearls, she smiled at dinner parties, she packed lunches and decorated cakes and drove to school pickups. But behind her carefully curled hair, behind the pastel wallpaper, she often felt like she was drowning. The post-war years promised comfort and normalcy, the nuclear family, the suburb, the sparkling new appliances. But for many women, these promises became cages. In Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, she described it as the problem that has no name. She interviewed housewives across the country who felt inexplicably empty, restless, anxious, and ashamed of it. They had everything they were supposed to want, but they couldn't sleep. They cried in laundry rooms. They drank before noon. Their husbands, doctors, even they themselves, dismissed it as nerves. The medical establishment responded with pills. In the mid-20th century, tranquilizers became a revolution, not in treatment but in containment. Miltown, Librium, Valium. Marketed directly to doctors and often implicitly to housewives, these medications promised calm, stability, obedience. Advertisements in glossy magazines showed beautiful women in aprons, their eyes serene, their homes immaculate. You can cope, the ad promised, with the help of science. And in many ways, they did help. For women crippled by panic attacks, by chronic dread, these drugs offered real relief. But the story was never so simple. Prescriptions were handed out without counselling, without diagnosis, without asking why. Why were so many women anxious? Why did they feel trapped, restless, invisible? Instead of exploring the roots, doctors medicated the symptoms, and women in turn began to lose trust in the systems meant to heal them. Some rebelled. The 1960s and 70s saw an eruption of voices. Feminist psychologists, writers, and activists began to challenge the very foundations of how women's mental health was understood. They asked, what if anxiety wasn't weakness? What if it was rage turned inward, a scream muffled into a whisper? Writers like Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich spoke of the psychological cost of being silenced, of being told for centuries that fear was just nerves, that discomfort was just hormones, that dread was just a feminine flaw. Some women left their doctors, others tore up their prescriptions, some stayed but asked harder questions. And still, anxiety lingered. It showed up in migraines, in ulcers, in sleepless nights, in clenched jaws and shallow breaths, in avoidance and self-doubt. The world was changing, but the legacy was long. Even as new medications arrived, even as therapy evolved, the stereotype of the anxious woman remained. It clung to her like a perfume she didn't choose. She was dramatic. She was unstable. She was too much, or not enough. The language became more clinical. Words like generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder entered the DSM. Cognitive behavioral therapy gained traction. Psychiatry refined its classifications. But beneath the new labels, the same old questions pulsed. Who gets to define sanity? Whose fear is valid? And when a woman says, "I'm not okay," why is she still so often told to smile? By the late 20th century, anxiety was no longer hidden. It was on talk shows, in self-help books, in journal articles. But for many women, it still remained lonely. They had tools, but not always understanding. They had diagnoses, but not always care. They had pills, but not always peace. And so the anxious woman of the modern age stood at a crossroads, no longer locked away, no longer called possessed, but still aching for someone to truly listen. Someone who wouldn't reduce her to a chart, a chemical imbalance, a stereotype. Someone who would ask, "What happened to you?" And then wait for the answer. The sun set on the 20th century with a strange mixture of noise and silence. The world was faster, louder, brighter, a humming hive of screens and circuits. And yet, for many women, the quiet ache of anxiety had not lessened. It had simply adapted. It wore new clothes now, spoke a new language, hid behind polite emails and fluorescent-lit offices. This new century did not banish fear, it repackaged it. Let us begin this next chapter in the quiet glow of a bedroom around the year 2003. A woman lies awake at 3:17 a.m. The room is still, but her thoughts are not. Her chest is tight, her jaw sore from clenching. She scrolls on her phone. Something about a natural disaster, a missing girl, a rising cost of living. She's not sure what she's looking for, only that she cannot sleep. This is not madness. This is not hysteria. This is not melancholia. This is modern anxiety. And for women, it remains deeply familiar. By the early 2000s, mental health had entered the public discourse more boldly. Celebrities spoke about therapy. Schools introduced counseling programs. Bookshelves filled with memoirs about panic, depression, and recovery. And yet, despite this growing openness, the lived experience of anxiety for women was still shaped by centuries of silence. The language had changed, the stigma had softened, but the expectations remained. Now, women were expected to have it all. A career, a relationship, a body toned and glowing, a schedule organized down to the last vitamin supplement. They were praised for being strong, resilient, driven. But if they faltered, if they trembled or wept or said, "I can't do this anymore," then came the old whispers. Overreacting, oversensitive, overwhelmed. The 21st century anxious woman often walked a tightrope no one acknowledged. At work, she smiled through meetings, answered emails at midnight, said yes more than she wanted to. At home, she juggled groceries, aging parents, children's appointments, friends' crises, unpaid bills. She drank green juice in the morning and wine at night. She tried meditation apps, magnesium powder, therapy podcasts, journaling prompts. She didn't call it a breakdown. She called it burnout. In the medical world, anxiety disorders became the most commonly diagnosed mental health condition in women. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety, health anxiety, postpartum anxiety. The labels became precise, but the suffering remained complex. And still a gendered gap persisted. Studies showed that women were far more likely than men to be diagnosed with anxiety, but they were also more likely to have their symptoms minimized by doctors. Complaints of chest pain or shortness of breath were more often written off as stress rather than tested for underlying issues. Women in emergency rooms were told to relax, to breathe deeply, to consider counseling. In one chilling study, researchers found that women having heart attacks were more likely to be misdiagnosed because their pain was interpreted as anxiety. And in another, doctors were more likely to prescribe anti-anxiety medication to women for identical symptoms presented by male patients. The history still whispered. A woman who cried in the office bathroom wasn't passionate. She was unstable. A woman who asked for help wasn't self-aware. She was needy. A woman who couldn't stop worrying wasn't insightful. She was overbearing. So many women learned to hide it. Again, they learned to cry quietly, to take medication without mentioning it, to joke about their insomnia. They posted memes about anxiety to make others laugh and to cover their fear. They sat in group chats full of spiraling thoughts, while outside they looked calm, competent, well-adjusted. And yet, something was shifting. Social media, for all its chaos, created spaces for shared experience. In online forums, anonymous women typed out late-night confessions. "I can't breathe sometimes, and I don't know why. My heart races for hours, even though nothing's wrong. I'm tired all the time, but I can't sleep. Is this anxiety? Is this normal?" And in return, voices, echoes, stories. Women from all walks of life sharing their truths. The single mother in Detroit, the college student in Seoul, the businesswoman in Berlin, the retiree in a quiet Canadian town. They wrote not to complain, but to be understood. Slowly, therapy became less taboo. More women began seeking out care and demanding better care. Trauma-informed therapists, female practitioners, support groups built not around diagnoses but lived experiences. The language shifted again. People began to speak not just of mental illness but of emotional injuries, chronic stress, micro-traumas. The 1,000 cuts of modern womanhood that accumulate like static in the nervous system. They began to say, "Of course I'm anxious." And it wasn't a flaw, it was an indicator, a signal, a cry for something deeper than medication alone. Yet, even with this growth, inequality remained. Access to mental health care was still a luxury for many. Racial and economic disparities shaped who could get help and who was dismissed. A black woman reporting anxiety in a hospital might be seen as aggressive. An immigrant woman might fear seeking help at all. A trans woman might struggle to find a provider who acknowledged her identity. The anxious woman was not a monolith. She was infinite in her forms, and each carried the weight of history differently. Still, amidst all this complexity, one thing emerged clearly. Women were reclaiming the narrative. No longer content to be studied from a distance, or whispered about in corridors, or dulled into submission, they began to write again, to speak. Podcasts, essays, documentaries, stand-up routines, art exhibits, zines, quiet personal projects shared between friends. Their voices were not always loud, but they were insistent. "I am anxious," they said, "and I am still worthy. I am overwhelmed," they said, "and I am still whole. I am afraid," they said, "and I deserve to be heard." This, perhaps, was the quiet revolution. Not a cure, not an end, but a shift in meaning. Anxiety had always lived in women's stories. But now, women were writing those stories themselves. And in doing so, they began to answer a question that had echoed across centuries. What does it mean to feel too much in a world that asks you to feel less? It meant being human. And finally, being believed. It is strange how something as invisible as anxiety can shape so many visible parts of life. In the 8th part of this story, which now stretches across millennia, we find ourselves in the most intimate space of all, the body. By the early decades of the 21st century, science had peeled back layers of the human brain with astonishing precision. Neural pathways were mapped, brain scans lit up like constellations, showing patterns of fear, stress, and memory. Hormones and neurotransmitters had names now: cortisol, adrenaline, serotonin, dopamine. These were the architects of the anxious state. And yet, for many women, even with all this clarity, something was still being missed. Because for her, anxiety was not just in the brain, it was everywhere. It lived in her breath, shallow and fast, It lived in her stomach, twisted, aching, tight. It lived in her skin, flushed, tingling, crawling with electricity. It lived in her chest, pounding and pressing, as if trying to escape. The anxious woman of the modern age knew all too well that her body was both messenger and prison. Let us pause in a small clinic in Chicago, in the year 2015. A woman sits across from a primary care doctor. She is 38 years old. She has been to this office 4 times in 6 months. She complains of chest pain, headaches, nausea, persistent fatigue. Blood tests show nothing. Her heart scan is clear. The doctor flips through the chart and says, not unkindly, it's probably anxiety. She nods, but something tightens in her throat. She wants to ask, but if it's anxiety, why does it feel like I'm dying? What she doesn't know is that her experience is one of the most common expressions of anxiety in women, the somatic kind. Unlike the media portrayals of anxiety, which often show someone pacing or hyperventilating, real anxiety in women often settles into the body. It disguises itself as dizziness, digestive distress, muscle pain, fatigue, or even numbness. It masquerades as autoimmune flares. It disturbs sleep, digestion, libido, appetite. And when she finally seeks help, she often walks through a maze. From general practitioners to specialists, from tests to referrals. The symptoms don't match. Nothing seems conclusive. And so she hears a word she's grown to dread, psychosomatic, not fake, not imagined, but somehow less real. The mind-body divide is an old wound in medicine. For centuries, women's pain was filtered through suspicion. If it wasn't visible, it was minimized. If it didn't show up in blood work or imaging, it was downgraded to stress. But science, despite its slowness, was beginning to catch up. New research began to show what many women had already lived, that anxiety could change the body. Chronic stress altered immune function. It raised inflammation markers. It disrupted hormones, increased blood pressure, triggered migraines, and disturbed the gut microbiome. The phrase gut feeling took on new meaning as studies showed direct communication between the gut and brain, the enteric nervous system as it was now called. Women, whose bodies fluctuate through cycles, pregnancies, hormonal shifts, were particularly sensitive to these physiological changes. The anxious woman was not weak. She was tuned. Sensitive, yes, but not fragile. Her body was responding loudly to something it could no longer hold quietly. For some women, this meant embracing a deeper kind of care. They learned to watch their bodies the way one watches weather, not with panic, but attention. They noted what foods made them tremble, what people made them clench, what rooms caused their heart rate to rise before they even sat down. They began to speak a new language, not just of diagnoses, but of triggers, of regulation, of nervous system healing. They used weighted blankets, practiced breath work, moved slowly through yoga poses, drank herbal teas not because it was quaint, but because it calmed their parasympathetic response. They began to see their bodies not as betrayers, but as informants, as truth-tellers. Still, not every woman had the privilege of time, space, or resources for this kind of introspection. The single mother working 2 jobs could not attend breathwork classes. The woman in chronic pain without health insurance could not experiment with supplements. The immigrant mother trying to navigate a new healthcare system in a language not her own could not always articulate what anxiety felt like in her bones. And so, for many, the journey remained confusing, lonely, and deeply physical. There were women who lived in constant fear of fainting, not because they were fragile, but because anxiety had trained their nervous systems to overreact. There were women who avoided driving, elevators, airplanes, not because they lacked courage, but because their bodies went into panic the moment the door closed, and still the world judged them. Friends said, "You're overreacting." Family said, "You worry too much." Doctors said, "Just calm down." Their bodies said, "Danger." But danger was not always real. Sometimes it was memory. Sometimes it was learned hypervigilance. Sometimes it was the legacy of past trauma, abuse, loss, neglect, stored in the tissues, surfacing through palpitations and nausea. New therapists, especially those trained in somatic work, began to approach anxiety differently. Instead of asking, "What are you afraid of?" they asked, "Where do you feel that in your body?" A simple question, but profound. Because for women, anxiety had rarely been about nothing. It had always been a reaction, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes suppressed, sometimes dismissed, but always a reaction. to being silenced, to being expected to endure, to carrying generations of unspoken grief and labor and vigilance in their very skin. One woman, after her third panic attack in a month, finally allowed herself to cry in her car. Not because she was weak, but because her body was tired of pretending. Another learned to unclench her jaw for the first time in 30 years. Another stood barefoot in her kitchen and realized she hadn't breathed deeply in weeks. Healing for these women did not come all at once. It came in fragments, small permissions, a longer exhale, a softer pillow, a skipped invitation, a sentence spoken out loud. I feel overwhelmed. I don't know why. I need a moment. It wasn't about conquering anxiety. It was about no longer fighting their own bodies. Because what if the trembling, the sweating, the short breath, the quickened pulse, what if all of it was not a malfunction? What if it was a message, a call to return, to listen, to soften? Not every woman found that path, but more and more did, and in doing so they began to rewrite the story of anxiety, not as an enemy but as a companion. An unwelcome one, perhaps, but one that had followed them for centuries. One that at last they were beginning to understand. By the time we reach this 9th chapter, we are no longer speaking of anxiety as just an affliction. We are speaking of it as a lineage, a kind of emotional inheritance passed from mother to daughter, sister to sister, friend to friend, not always through words, but through glances, silences, habits, hesitations. Anxiety, for many women, was never simply theirs. It came before them, wrapped in the tension of generations, and it lives quietly inside families, tucked between recipes and bedtime routines and whispered instructions. Don't make a fuss. Be careful. Don't speak too loudly. Don't draw attention. This is where we arrive, the intersection of anxiety and legacy, the place where psychology meets ancestry, where culture meets biology, where memory is not only what we recall, but what we carry in the blood. Let us pause in a kitchen somewhere in the 1980s. A young girl watches her mother stir soup. The mother pauses every few minutes to check the stove, to wipe the counter, to recheck the lock on the back door. Her hands flutter slightly. Her brow is always furrowed. She doesn't call it anxiety. She calls it being thorough, responsible, just the way she is. The daughter doesn't question it. But years later she finds herself doing the same thing, double-checking, anticipating, preparing for something that never quite arrives. We do not always inherit trauma directly. Sometimes we inherit the behaviors created to survive it. In recent years, scientists began to explore this phenomenon in earnest. The study of epigenetics, the way experiences can leave chemical marks on our DNA, passed to future generations, began to reshape how we understand emotional inheritance. It is now known that chronic stress, especially in pregnant women, can influence the developing fetus. Cortisol crosses the placenta. The mother's anxiety shapes the child's stress response. This isn't blame, it's biology. And it confirms what so many women already knew instinctively, that emotion is not just felt, but absorbed. For generations, women were told to endure, to keep calm, to hold the family together. Their griefs were often private, their tears often wiped away in silence. And so their anxiety became coded into patterns of overfunctioning, of self-denial, of control. A woman who cannot sit still. A woman who apologizes before she speaks. A woman who plans every detail, who thinks 5 steps ahead. A woman who expects the worst, not because she's pessimistic, but because the women before her had to survive that way. This is how anxiety lives on, not always in panic attacks or breakdowns, but in invisible rituals, in unspoken rules, in a quiet vigilance taught too young. Cultural inheritance plays its part too. In some cultures, anxiety is spoken of through the body. My heart is tired, says the Vietnamese grandmother. The blood in my head is hot, says the Mexican aunt. In others, it is cloaked in duty. The eldest daughter who sacrifices for the family. The widow who must smile at the wedding. The matriarch who never speaks of the war. Different languages, different customs, but the same tremble beneath the surface. And then there is the silence between generations. That aching gap where questions are never asked and stories never told. A granddaughter wonders why she flinches at loud voices, why she feels unsafe when nothing is wrong, why she dreams of drowning. She doesn't know her grandmother once hid in a cellar during bombings, that her mother never learned how to be comforted, that no one ever taught them that fear could be named. This silence, too, is a kind of inheritance. Some women begin to break it. One in her 40s decides to ask her mother, "Were you ever afraid?" The mother stiffens, says, "Of course not." But her eyes shine in a way that says otherwise. Another finds an old letter in a drawer, her great-aunt institutionalized in the 1930s, writing, "I cannot rest, I cannot breathe, but I promise I am not mad." Another opens a family photo album and sees the pattern. The anxious eyes, the stoic mouths, the hands always folded in laps like they're holding something in. As women begin to explore their anxiety through therapy, journaling, spiritual work, or just honest conversation, many find themselves circling back to their families. Not to blame, but to understand. To understand why they feel the need to overachieve, why rest feels unsafe, why love makes them nervous, why joy feels so fleeting, why the thought of failing, even privately, makes their stomach twist. Some discover that anxiety has always been part of their lineage, shaped not just by personality, but by the places their ancestors lived, the traumas endured, the wars survived, the migrations, the losses, the rebuilding. In some Jewish families, it's the echo of the Holocaust. In some black families, it's the residue of slavery and systemic violence. In some indigenous families, it's the inheritance of colonization, displacement, erasure. In some Asian families, it's the pressure of perfection, of filial piety, of silent endurance. The anxiety is not imagined. It is remembered, even if the remembering is done without words. And still, many women never learn the full story. They carry a fear that doesn't belong entirely to them, and yet feels rooted in their marrow. But knowledge begins to shift things. The woman who notices her daughter clenching her fists at age 5 and asks gently, "What do you feel right now?" The woman who says aloud at dinner, "I'm anxious today, and that's okay." The woman who speaks of her mother not only as a caretaker, but as someone who was deeply, privately afraid. This kind of awareness is not a cure, but it is a break in the pattern. It says, we don't have to carry this in silence anymore. And slowly the weight shifts, not because it disappears, but because it is finally shared. Not buried, not shamed, not passed along without question, just held and seen and named. And in that small naming, in that whispered truth between generations, a kind of healing begins. The 10th part of this story leads us into one of the most misunderstood places in a woman's life: motherhood. For centuries, motherhood has been painted in glowing tones: Madonna and child, lullabies, soft lighting in magazine spreads. It is praised as sacred, natural, fulfilling. But beneath that radiant surface lies another truth, long obscured. Motherhood can be terrifying. And for many women, it is precisely when they become mothers that anxiety tightens its grip. Not always immediately. Sometimes it begins with the quiet dread of pregnancy, a fear that something might go wrong, that their body might fail them, that they aren't prepared. Sometimes it starts in labor, in the sterile room filled with monitors and the constant hum of risk. Sometimes it doesn't bloom until weeks later, when the house is quiet and the baby is crying and the mother cannot stop trembling. This anxiety has a name now: perinatal anxiety, postpartum anxiety, postnatal OCD. But for most of history, it had no name. It was hidden beneath words like baby blues, or dismissed as a mother just being a little overwhelmed. Let us enter a nursery in the early morning, the sky still grey with sleep. A woman rocks her infant in the half-light. Her body aches. Her eyes are dry from exhaustion. The baby is fed, clean, asleep. But still, the mother's chest feels tight. Her breath comes short. Her thoughts race. What if the baby stops breathing? What if she didn't latch properly? What if she is doing everything wrong? She doesn't say this aloud. She thinks she shouldn't feel this way. And so she smiles when someone visits, says she's fine, she's just tired. The expectation of joy is heavy, so heavy that many mothers feel ashamed to admit their fear. They believe anxiety means they're failing, that if they worry too much, if they can't sleep even when the baby sleeps, if they cry in the shower, something must be wrong with them. But the truth is that childbirth is not just a biological event. It is a neurological, hormonal, and psychological upheaval. A woman's body floods with estrogen, oxytocin, prolactin, and then those levels drop dramatically after birth. Her brain rewires itself to focus on the infant's needs. Her sleep is fragmented. Her sense of identity shifts. Her freedom vanishes overnight. All of these are fertile grounds for anxiety. And yet, in so many cultures, the new mother is left alone. In the United States and parts of Europe, maternity leave is brief, inconsistent, or non-existent. Many women return to work while still bleeding, still sleep-deprived, still raw. They juggle daycare drop-offs, breast pumps in bathroom stalls, spreadsheets and stretch marks. Others stay home, isolated, their world shrinking to the square footage of a living room. Their days become a cycle of feedings, diaper changes, and Googling symptoms at 2 a.m. In both cases, overworked or overlooked, the anxiety builds. Some women experience panic attacks. Others develop compulsive rituals, checking the baby's breathing every few minutes, sterilizing bottles again and again, replaying every moment of the day to make sure they didn't make a mistake. These are not flaws in love. These are the mind trying desperately to protect what it holds most dear. And yet, even in modern hospitals, many women are still screened only for postpartum depression, not anxiety. They are asked if they feel sad, not if they feel afraid. They are asked if they've lost interest in things, not if they lie awake imagining worst-case scenarios. And so, thousands of women each year go undiagnosed. They carry their fear alone, hidden behind pastel-coloured baby blankets and Instagram posts. They are told to be grateful, to enjoy every moment, to cherish the time. But how do you cherish something when your heart won't stop racing? And then there are the women whose stories aren't even acknowledged. The ones who lost pregnancies, the ones whose babies came too early or not at all. The ones who struggled for years to conceive and now feel a suffocating fear that something will take it away. Their anxiety is often met with silence, because grief still makes people uncomfortable. In recent years, a growing number of doulas, midwives, and therapists have begun to speak more openly about maternal mental health. They say simply, this is common, this is real, this is not weakness, and for many mothers that is the first breath of relief. Some begin to write, blogs, anonymous posts, memoirs that say, I loved my baby and still felt like I was unraveling. Some gather in circles, online or in person, where they admit out loud, I'm afraid, I don't know what I'm doing, I haven't slept in days. And in response, they hear, me too. That phrase, me too, becomes a balm. Because maternal anxiety thrives in isolation. It loses strength in solidarity. Older mothers sometimes speak too. They say, I wish someone had told me. They say, I thought it was just me. They say, I still feel it even now, decades later. This is the part of anxiety's story that doesn't fade with time. Even when the babies grow into children and the children into adults, many mothers carry a low hum of fear. They worry they didn't do enough, that they made mistakes, that their anxiety somehow shaped their children's lives. And perhaps it did, but not always in the way they fear. Because some of those children grow up remembering a mother who checked the doors twice, who packed too many snacks, who cried quietly in the kitchen, and later they understand, they forgive, they thank her. Anxious mothers are not broken mothers. They are protective. They are attuned. They are fierce, even when they feel fragile. And in speaking now, after centuries of silence, they are rewriting what it means to be a mother. Not a saint, not a statue, not a perfect figure in a painting, but a human. Breathing, shaking, loving, trying. And in the tremble of her hands, something sacred still lives. Not failure, not fragility, but care. Relentless, aching, undeniable care. Part 11 takes us into a place where the lights never fully go off, the workplace. It is where ambition, structure, performance and identity converge, where women for the last century have steadily carved out presence and power. But behind the closed doors of offices, under fluorescent bulbs and digital calendars, anxiety walks quietly in heels and business suits. The workplace is not neutral. It never has been. It is built on rituals and hierarchies, unspoken codes of power and productivity. And for women, especially anxious women, it is often a battlefield disguised as a boardroom. Let us begin in an elevator, sometime in the early 2000s. A woman holds her briefcase. She checks her phone again. Her heart beats fast, not from exertion, but from dread. A meeting in 5 minutes. A presentation. She reviewed it 12 times last night. She hasn't eaten. She practiced smiling in the mirror this morning. And still, she feels like a child in grown-up clothing. The elevator dings. She steps out. She becomes a professional. This woman is not failing. She is performing. And anxiety for her has become both the weight and the engine. In many offices, anxiety is mistaken for ambition. The woman who stays late, who says yes to everything, who never takes a sick day, she is praised for her dedication. No one asks if she's driven by a deep fear of falling behind, of being seen as lazy, of being replaced. Women in particular are conditioned to overcompensate in professional settings, to smile more, to soften their tone, to preface suggestions with "sorry but" or "just an idea," to work twice as hard for half the credit. And so anxiety becomes embedded in their every move. Not just about deadlines, but about perception. Did I sound too aggressive? Did I talk too much in that meeting? Did I smile enough? Did I smile too much? Am I being taken seriously or too seriously? For women of colour, disabled women, queer women, neurodivergent women, these anxieties multiply. The pressure to code switch, to conform, to appear professional according to standards not built for them is relentless. Their anxiety is not only internal, it is systemic. And still, they show up. Every morning they enter offices, log into Zoom meetings, draft reports, lead teams, and often they do it with a tightness in their chest and a smile on their face, because to be vulnerable is still risky. To say I'm anxious might invite concern or worse, doubt. She fears being seen as unreliable. She fears being passed over for promotion. She fears becoming the subject of whispered pity. So instead, she copes. She keeps rescue medication in her purse. She memorizes breathing techniques. She takes walks around the block and calls them coffee breaks. She learns how to cry in bathrooms without leaving traces. This is not weakness. This is endurance. Some women turn their anxiety into excellence, using their vigilance to anticipate problems, their attention to detail to perfect presentations, their sensitivity to create inclusive teams. But the cost is high. Many burn out quietly, resign from positions they excel at, or vanish into sabbaticals that no one understands. And the culture of productivity does not help. In a society that values output above well-being, rest is rebellion. Saying, "I need time," feels like failure. But anxiety cannot thrive in stillness. It needs noise, motion, fear. So the workplace becomes its perfect habitat. Yet, there are cracks in the structure now. The pandemic shifted how people work. Remote offices revealed both freedoms and isolations. Women, especially those balancing caregiving, began to speak more openly about mental health. Some leaders responded with empathy, others with silence. Wellness programs emerged, offering meditation apps and mental health days. But these gestures, while well-intentioned, often missed the root. The culture of overwork, the lack of psychological safety, the pressure to always be on. Real change comes not from perks, but from permission. Permission to say, "I'm overwhelmed. I need help with this project. I made a mistake and I'm still valuable. I'm anxious, but I still belong here." In a few rare workplaces, women are beginning to hear those words echoed back. Managers are starting meetings with check-ins. HR policies now include mental health accommodations. Co-workers leave notes that say, "Take the time you need." These are small revolutions, quiet but profound. And inside those spaces, women are learning something new, that anxiety does not always have to be hidden to be respected. A woman gives a presentation with shaking hands, and no one calls her unprepared. A woman asks for a deadline extension, and no one questions her worth. A woman leads a team, speaks openly about therapy, and no one doubts her strength. But it is still rare. Most women still carry their anxiety like a secret badge. They succeed despite it. They persevere through it, but few are invited to succeed with it, to be seen fully, fears and all, and still be trusted. Some find solidarity in whispers after meetings. "I feel that way too." "You're not alone." "I'm always scared before I speak, but you'd never know." Others begin to advocate, not only for themselves but for those who can't. They create Slack channels for mental health. They add mental health advocate to their signatures. They challenge cultures that reward only overextension. They redefine leadership as emotional intelligence, not just stamina. The anxious woman in the workplace is not broken. She is navigating a terrain not built with her in mind. And yet, she builds new paths for herself, for others. Sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, always with care. Her anxiety may not leave, but it no longer needs to be hidden to be honored. It is not a disqualifier, it is part of her story. And she tells it not to gain sympathy, but to offer truth. Because somewhere in another office, another woman is sitting at her desk, trying to breathe through a rising panic. thinking she is the only one, and if the door opens even metaphorically, she might step through, she might stay, and she might finally believe there is space for me here, exactly as I am. There is a particular kind of anxiety that grows in the space between the self and the mirror, between the way a woman feels in her body and the way the world sees her in it. In this 12th part of the story, we move into that intimate, uneasy terrain, the anxious relationship between women and appearance. Not vanity, not self-obsession, but survival. For centuries, a woman's value was entangled with how she looked, her beauty, her weight, her skin, her symmetry. And though the shapes and standards have changed from era to era, the pressure has never quite lifted. Instead, it has sharpened into expectation. And expectation, when unrelenting, becomes anxiety. Let us begin in front of a bathroom mirror, in a quiet house at 6:45 a.m. A young woman examines her face under harsh lighting. She pulls gently at her eyelids, tilts her chin. Her skin isn't clear. Her eyes look tired. She applies concealer, then another layer. She's not trying to be glamorous. She's just trying to feel safe. Safe from comment. Safe from judgment. Safe from the feeling of being seen and not being enough. This is not about ego. This is about defense. Body-based anxiety often begins early, before puberty, before language for it even exists. A girl notices the way her mother talks about her own weight. She sees how magazines praise thinness and youth. She hears compliments that focus only on appearance. Slowly, without being told directly, she learns that beauty is currency, and her self-worth begins to live in the reflection, not the reality. The changes that adolescence brings only deepen the rift. Breasts, hips, periods, the body becomes public property. Commented on by classmates, relatives, strangers. A girl learns to shrink, to laugh off discomfort, to carry her arms in front of her stomach. By adulthood, the anxiety is fully internalized. She knows how to pose for pictures in flattering angles. She has memorized her good side. She buys clothes that hide more than they express. She watches other women, not out of jealousy, but as a mirror. Am I okay? Do I measure up? Should I try harder? The beauty industry, of course, knows this. It thrives on it. Advertisements do not just sell lipstick or retinol or shapewear. They sell the dream of certainty, that if you look right, you will feel right. That if you can just lose the weight, clear the skin, brighten the eyes, the noise will quiet. But it doesn't, because the noise isn't in the mirror, it's in the nervous system. Body-based anxiety is not always visible. It doesn't always look like disordered eating or obsessive exercise. Sometimes it looks like avoidance. Cancelling plans because nothing fits, staying out of photos, hiding behind humour, turning intimacy into performance, or fleeing from it entirely. And for many women, this anxiety sharpens with transitions. Pregnancy, postpartum, menopause, illness, weight gain, weight loss, aging. The body changes, and with it, the uneasy contract between self and society must be renegotiated again and again. And each time the fear returns. Will I still be loved like this? Will I still be seen or only pitied? Will I disappear now that I'm no longer what I once was? Some women fight it head on. They throw away scales. They post unfiltered photos. They say, "This is my body. This is enough." Others do it more quietly. They walk without makeup. They speak to themselves gently. They begin therapy and talk for the first time about the day their anxiety began. Not in adulthood, but at 12, when someone said they looked bigger than last year, and it never left. And still there are many who live in that unease daily. The woman who avoids dressing rooms. The woman who skips doctor visits for fear of being weighed. The woman who cannot receive a compliment without deflecting. The woman who eats alone, not because she wants solitude, but because it feels safer. And yet slowly culture begins to shift. Movements arise, body neutrality, body liberation, fat acceptance. Not to celebrate aesthetic, but to dismantle the hierarchy of worth that has imprisoned so many women. The conversation widens, representation improves, language changes. Healthy no longer means thin. Beautiful is no longer the highest praise. But anxiety is not undone by slogans. It requires care. And that care often comes not from glossy campaigns, but from personal moments. A woman looks at a photograph of herself from 5 years ago. She remembers hating how she looked that day. But now she sees softness, strength, something tender. She wonders why she wasted so much energy wishing herself away. Another woman stops wearing Spanx. Not because she stopped caring, but because she started breathing. Another wears a swimsuit after 20 years. She does not feel beautiful, but she feels free, and that is enough. And sometimes the healing comes from community. Women telling each other, I felt that way too. You're not alone. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to be beautiful to be respected. These are small sentences, but they are antidotes to the noise, to the shame, to the legacy that taught women to apologize for taking up space. Because in the end, body-based anxiety is about more than mirrors. It's about belonging. And when a woman begins to feel that she belongs in her skin, in her clothes, in her presence, something changes. The anxiety doesn't vanish, but it quiets, it softens, it steps back, no longer steering the ship. And she at last can stand still, not waiting to be seen, not waiting to be approved, just here whole. Without performance, present, without permission, enough, without condition. There are few places where anxiety sharpens so subtly, so persistently, as in relationships. Romantic ones especially, where love promises comfort, and yet so often delivers contradiction. In this 13th part of our story, we walk into bedrooms, into late-night silences, into long conversations that end in tension, not resolution. This is where anxiety becomes entangled with intimacy. Love, in its ideal form, is supposed to soothe. But for many anxious women, it does the opposite. It opens a door, not just to connection, but to exposure, to being known, and to the risk that comes with it. Let us imagine a woman lying next to someone she loves. The room is dark. The air is still. Her partner is already asleep. She should feel calm, safe. But instead, her thoughts are racing. Did I say something wrong earlier? Did they pull away from me slightly after dinner? Why didn't they reply to my text right away this morning? What if they leave? What if I'm too much? What if I'm not enough? She doesn't speak these questions. She turns over, quiet. She doesn't want to sound insecure. This, the unspoken spiral, is one of anxiety's most common paths through love. It can begin even before the relationship does. In the early stages, anxious women often overanalyze. Every text, every pause, every shift in tone becomes data. They want reassurance, but fear asking for it. They want to seem easygoing, but feel anything but. Some become what therapists call anxious preoccupied, hyper-attuned to their partner's moods, always scanning for signs of withdrawal. Others swing the other way, avoidant, dismissive, pretending they don't care to avoid the pain of caring too much. Both are strategies, both are shields. Because love, for the anxious woman, is not always soft. Sometimes it feels like waiting for the other shoe to drop, especially if trust has been broken before. Many women carry old scars into new relationships. A betrayal, a toxic partner, a marriage that grew cold, a childhood where love meant instability. And so when someone new enters their life, the anxiety is not about them, exactly. It's about memory, about the nervous system flinching before the mind even registers why. And it shows up in small, quiet ways, needing constant validation, then feeling ashamed for asking, withdrawing to test if they'll come closer, over-explaining feelings, reading between lines that were never written, feeling a sudden wave of dread after a beautiful moment, as if joy must be punished. And often their partners don't understand. They say, "Why are you always worrying?" Or, "You have nothing to be afraid of." Or worse, "You're too sensitive, too emotional, too much." And so the woman shuts down. She learns to silence her needs, to bottle the fear, to handle her spirals alone, in bathrooms, in car rides, in messages to friends that begin with, "I know I'm probably overreacting, but she isn't overreacting. She's reacting from the blueprint of her body, from the echoes of past harm, from a nervous system trained to expect loss." And some women stay in relationships where this anxiety is not just misunderstood, it is used against them. Gaslighting, emotional withdrawal, dismissiveness disguised as calm. The anxious woman begins to believe she is the problem, that her fear is the poison, not the warning. But not all anxious women end up in unhealthy relationships. Many find love that is steady, patient, real. And still the anxiety doesn't disappear, because love cannot erase what history has carved. So instead, the work becomes learning to live with it. Learning to name it without shame, to say "I'm feeling anxious right now" instead of acting out, to ask for reassurance, not demand it, to soothe oneself, not abandon oneself, to pause before spiraling, to stay. And in doing so, a woman begins to trust not just the relationship, but herself. In recent years, relationship therapists have started to frame anxiety differently, not as pathology, but as protection. An anxious mind is often trying to forecast pain, to prevent hurt by anticipating it. It's a defense mechanism, a survival instinct. Not something to shame, but something to understand. Some women turn to attachment theory. They learn about their patterns. They connect dots that once felt chaotic. They see that they are not alone, that millions feel this way. Others write, or journal, or create rituals that anchor them. A morning walk, a grounding touch, a mantra that says, I am safe, even when I feel afraid. And some women begin to speak more honestly in love. They say, I tend to overthink when I feel distant. I need you to be clear with me, because ambiguity makes my mind spiral. I am working on this, but sometimes I'll need you to meet me halfway. And when they are met with empathy, with warmth, with steadiness, something softens. Love does not fix anxiety, but love that holds space for it can change everything. It can teach a woman that she is not a burden, that her feelings are valid, that closeness is not always followed by abandonment, and in return, she offers something rare, depth, presence. A heart that has been tested and still chooses to trust. Because the anxious woman is not incapable of love. She is simply loving from a place that has known too much uncertainty. And yet, she keeps loving anyway. Not because it's easy, but because it's brave. There is a peculiar silence that descends when the world assumes you should have figured it out by now. A stillness made not of peace, but of pressure. In this 14th part of the story, we enter the quiet ache of midlife, that often invisible corridor between youth and old age, where anxiety evolves once again, not in volume, but in texture. This is where the anxious woman begins to ask questions she never used to ask. Not just, am I okay, but is this it? Let us walk for a moment with a woman in her late 40s. She is folding laundry in a room lit by late afternoon sun. The house is quiet. Her children, if she has them, are older now. Her parents, if they're still living, are beginning to need care. Her job is steady, though perhaps numbing. Her face in the mirror is changing, and inside there is a restless current she cannot name. It is not the same anxiety she felt in her 20s. Sharp, electric, tied to proving something. This anxiety is heavier, quieter. It lingers in her mornings, it hums beneath her daily tasks. It creeps into her evenings, not as panic, but as a kind of grief. The grief of a woman who has spent decades showing up for others, for expectations, for systems, and now wonders softly, when do I get to be a person again? This is not a breakdown, it is an awakening, but it can feel like fear. At this stage, anxiety often takes the form of restlessness. Insomnia returns, not from racing thoughts, but from a body that refuses to settle. There are tight muscles, heart flutters, forgotten memories that surface unexpectedly. A strange, persistent sense that time is speeding up and slipping away. Hormonal changes add to the noise. As estrogen begins to decline, the nervous system becomes more sensitive. Hot flashes mimic panic attacks. Night sweats disturb sleep. Irritability sharpens into shame. For many women, perimenopause becomes a second adolescence, except no one prepares them for it. Doctors often dismiss their symptoms. It's stress. It's just aging. It's in your head. And sometimes it is in her head, but not in the way they mean. It's in the echoes of all the things she hasn't said. It's in the dreams she folded up to make room for others. It's in the deep internal whisper. Something is missing. For women at midlife, anxiety is not always about danger. Sometimes it's about invisibility. They begin to disappear in the culture, no longer considered young, not yet elderly. Advertisements forget them. Workplaces overlook them. Social circles shift. They become the background characters in their own stories. And the anxiety is not just about what's next, it's about who am I now? Some women find themselves grieving without a clear object. They grieve the girl they used to be. They grieve the paths not taken. They grieve the way their bodies feel unfamiliar. They grieve how quiet the house is now. They grieve that they are grieving. Others discover a rebellious spark. They leave jobs, change cities, cut their hair, begin painting, take up running, start therapy for the first time, write novels at night while the rest of the house sleeps. It is not a crisis, it is a reckoning. Still, the anxiety lingers, because even liberation comes with questions. What if I waited too long? What if I disappoint everyone? What if I'm too late to begin again? But no one is too late, especially not now. In recent years, a quiet movement has begun. Women speaking openly about midlife as a portal, not a prison. Podcasts, essays, circles of conversation. They speak about rage, about desire, about rest, about being done with people-pleasing. They speak about anxiety, not as a disorder, but as a messenger, a signal that the current life no longer fits, that pretending to be content is no longer working, that something new wants to emerge, even if it doesn't yet have a name. And there is courage in that. The courage to stop shrinking, to let go of roles that no longer nourish, to question what success means, to stop apologizing for being tired or passionate or bored or angry. Some women discover that this is the first time in their lives they've had a moment to even ask what they want, not what's expected. Not what's safe, but what they long for. And that question too comes with trembling, because longing makes us vulnerable. Because to admit we want more is to admit we don't yet have it, and that has always been dangerous for women. Still, more and more they ask, and sometimes the answer is small, more solitude, a garden, a room to write, a return to therapy, a weekend alone. Other times it's seismic, a divorce, a new degree, a goodbye, a yes to something terrifying and new. Either way, the anxiety changes. It becomes less about survival and more about truth. It speaks not in panic, but in insistence. It says you cannot pretend anymore. It says you are allowed to want. It says this is your life, not a dress rehearsal. And slowly the anxious woman of midlife begins to trust that voice, not because she has everything figured out, but because she is done waiting to be someone else. She is tired of shrinking. She is tired of guilt. She wants softness and wildness and rest, and though the anxiety may still hum at the edges, it no longer defines her. It has become a compass, not a curse, a call to return to herself, a chance to finally come home. There is a kind of loneliness that does not arrive suddenly, but accumulates slowly, in conversations that don't quite land, in texts left unanswered, in the quiet ache of feeling unseen, even while surrounded by others. In this 15th part of our story, we step into the anxiety of friendship, a relationship so often overlooked in the broader landscape of mental health, yet so deeply intertwined with a woman's sense of belonging. Friendship is often the first place where a girl learns emotional safety. It is where secrets are whispered, laughter is shared, and selfhood begins to unfold without the pressure of performance. But for many women, especially those living with anxiety, these early friendships also become places of subtle training, in self-silencing, in comparison, in fear of abandonment. Let us sit for a moment with a woman in her early 30s, scrolling through her phone late at night. She sees a photo of two close friends out to dinner. She wasn't invited. There's no malice in it. Maybe they thought she was busy. Maybe they forgot. But her body responds before her mind can reason. Her chest tightens. Her thoughts spiral. Did I do something wrong? Did I say too much last time? Did I not respond warmly enough? Am I being phased out? Am I too much or not enough? This is the anxious friendship loop, a familiar cycle for many women, particularly those who have learned to equate closeness with vigilance. In anxious minds, friendship can feel like a test that never ends. Every delayed response, every vague message, every missed plan can become evidence of impending loss. The fear is not only of being disliked, but of being quietly replaced, of being a burden, of being remembered differently than one meant to be. And unlike romantic relationships, where boundaries and emotional needs are often explicitly discussed, friendships tend to exist in a grey space, full of assumption, implication, and silence. Many anxious women become over-functioners in friendships. They are the planners, the rememberers, the ones who check in, who send birthday texts, who ask deep questions, who remember the coffee order. They pour themselves in with the hope that consistency will create safety. But when that energy is not reciprocated, they begin to question themselves, not the dynamic. Others pull back entirely. They fear rejection so deeply that they never fully invest. They become the flaky friend, the one who cancels, the one who ghosts not out of carelessness but out of internal chaos, the one who, behind the scenes, is quietly unraveling under the weight of guilt. And yet the truth is this: anxious women make devoted friends. They are loyal, attuned, thoughtful, emotionally present. Their anxiety does not make them broken friends, it makes them deep-feeling ones. But that same depth, when unspoken, can turn inward. Modern life only amplifies these tensions. As women age, friendships become harder to maintain. Careers, children, distance, they all conspire to stretch thin the thread of connection. And in the gaps, anxiety grows. She didn't reply. She must be mad. We haven't talked in months. She's probably moved on. She didn't laugh at my joke. Did I cross a line? Sometimes the fear is right. A friendship does fade, a rupture does happen, but other times it's just life. Just two people drifting, missing each other, both too unsure to reach out. In this silence, many anxious women suffer quietly. They don't want to seem needy. They don't want to ask for too much. They don't want to admit that something as small as friendship can keep them up at night. But it can. It does. Friendship, after all, is a cornerstone of emotional stability, especially for women who are often socialized to seek connection through emotional intimacy. When that intimacy is threatened, the foundation trembles. Some women begin to isolate, not out of bitterness, but out of fear. They stop texting first. They convince themselves they're fine alone. They scroll instead of reaching out. And slowly their social world becomes smaller, quieter, lonelier. Others cling too tightly, afraid to name their needs, so they overgive, over-explain, over-apologize, until the friendship is strained under the weight of unspoken fear. But there are moments of healing too. A woman writes a long, vulnerable message to a friend she hasn't spoken to in a year. The friend replies within minutes, "I've missed you. I've been going through so much. I'm so glad you wrote." Another woman finally tells a friend, "I get anxious sometimes in our friendship. I worry about losing you, and I don't always know how to say it." The friend doesn't flinch. She says, "Thank you for trusting me with that." These moments are rare, but they matter. They teach the anxious woman that she doesn't have to hide, that friendship, real friendship, can hold her fear and still remain. New friendships, too, begin to look different. In adulthood, women start seeking connections that are rooted in shared values, not just shared history. They look for ease, for honesty, for people who don't need them to perform stability. And some friendships, long past their expiration, are finally allowed to end. Not in bitterness, but in release. Because anxiety doesn't just thrive in abandonment, it also festers in forced maintenance. In staying too long in spaces where one's presence feels conditional. Letting go of those ties, too, is part of healing. In the end, the anxious woman learns that friendship is not about perfection. It's about presence, about mutuality, about the safety to be afraid and still be met with care. And perhaps most importantly, it's about learning to be her own friend first, to hold herself gently when others don't, to validate her fears without letting them drive her, to say, "Even if she forgets me, I will not forget myself." This is not loneliness. This is resilience. This is becoming whole. There are moments when the world around a woman no longer matches the pace of her interior life, when the outside remains calm, even as her inner landscape begins to quake. In this 16th part of our story, we walk into the quiet crisis of identity, the anxious unraveling that comes when the person a woman thought she was begins to shift, sometimes without her consent. It doesn't happen all at once. Identity for most women is constructed slowly, layer by layer. Daughter, student, partner, professional, mother, caregiver, leader. Each role carries expectation, and many women wear them dutifully, until one day something no longer fits. A sense of discomfort grows, vague and insistent. This is not about failure. This is about transformation. And transformation, while necessary, often begins with fear. Let us pause with a woman in her late 30s. She is driving home from work, stuck at a red light, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. There is no crisis, no job loss, no heartbreak, and yet she feels hollow, not sad, not angry, just distant from herself. Who am I, really? Do I even like the life I built? Have I made choices or just followed expectations? What if I want something else but don't know what it is? These questions arrive not as thunder but as mist, quiet, persistent, and underneath them, anxiety. Not the sharp, panicked kind, but the kind that whispers at 2 a.m, that makes her question decisions she once made with confidence, that tugs at the edges of her daily routines, asking, "Is this really you?" This is identity-based anxiety, a kind that often surfaces during transitions, After the end of a relationship, the birth of a child, the death of a parent, a career shift, a milestone birthday. It's the quiet terror of change, not forced from the outside, but stirred from within. And women, perhaps more than anyone, are trained to resist this unraveling. They are taught to define themselves in relation to others, to be someone's daughter, someone's partner, someone's colleague, to be what is needed, to adapt, to bend, to serve. So when a woman begins to feel distant from those roles, when she starts to question them, it can feel like betrayal. What if she no longer wants to be the peacemaker? What if she no longer enjoys the career she built her entire identity around? What if she no longer believes what she once defended with certainty? What if she wants less or more or something entirely different? And what if others can't understand? This fear of not being recognized, of being judged for changing, keeps many women frozen in identities they have outgrown. They stay in jobs they've long since stopped loving. They keep social circles where they no longer feel at ease. They uphold values that no longer resonate, because they are afraid of what will happen if they don't. Will I become unrecognizable? Will I lose my place in this world? Will I still be loved if I am no longer who I used to be? This kind of anxiety can manifest in countless ways. Sleeplessness, a sense of detachment, a sudden dread before routine tasks, an aversion to small talk, emotional numbness, a craving for solitude that feels both peaceful and shameful. It is the body's way of saying, the old self is dissolving, make room. But few people talk about this. Instead, the woman hears, you're having a midlife crisis, you're just burned out, you need a vacation. And maybe she does. But more than anything, she needs permission. Not to escape, but to evolve. Some women resist. They double down on the old identity. They push harder at work. They overinvest in parenting. They pretend to still enjoy the things that once lit them up, but the spark does not return. Others begin to loosen their grip. They let a friendship drift that once defined them. They start writing again after years of silence. They take long walks without music, just to hear their own thoughts. They ask themselves, without shame, what if I don't want to go back to who I was? This is the beginning of redefinition, and it is rarely tidy. There are moments of regret, waves of doubt, days when nothing feels solid, but there is also a strange, new clarity. The sense that something real is finally being allowed to emerge. A woman might leave her faith community, or return to it in a new way. She might go back to school, or decide that ambition as she once defined it is no longer hers. She might fall in love again, not with a person but with herself, with her solitude, with her curiosity, with the version of her that was buried beneath obligation. And sometimes anxiety flares up in this process, not because something is wrong, but because something old is dying. The anxious woman learns that her fear is not a warning. It is a companion, walking beside her as she rebuilds. She does not have to rush clarity. She does not have to justify her change. She does not have to mourn the past self with shame. She can grieve and grow at the same time. Because identity is not fixed, it is fluid. And every time a woman reclaims her sense of self, she does something radical. She says, I am not here to play a part. I am here to be a person. And that is not an end, that is a return. There are places where anxiety hides not in the mind or body, but in the future, in the imagined days ahead, in the plans that never settle, in the what-ifs that bloom like weeds through every possible outcome. In this 17th part of the story, we step into the anxious woman's relationship with uncertainty and her quiet, aching need for control. Control is often misunderstood. It's not always about power or rigidity. Sometimes it's about safety, about knowing that the world won't shift too fast, that the people we love will stay, that we will not be caught off guard. For the anxious woman, control is not arrogance. It is protection, a buffer between her and the unknown. Let us begin in the familiar space of her kitchen, the list already written in her head. Tomorrow's schedule, the groceries, the reply she forgot to send, the doctor appointment she needs to reschedule, the budget she's already run 3 times in her mind. She organizes, she prepares, she plans. Because if she can manage the details, perhaps she can quiet the dread. But dread does not care about preparation. It lives in the moments that cannot be planned. In the unexpected phone call, the sudden shift, the silence on the other end of a message. It lives in uncertainty. And that is where the anxious woman feels least at home. For many women, this starts young. Unpredictable households, emotionally volatile caregivers, traumas that came without warning. They learned that vigilance was safety, that reading a room could mean the difference between calm and chaos. Their nervous systems became attuned to threat, real or anticipated. And so they grew into adults who try to foresee everything. They research obsessively, they double-check locks, they reread conversations, they monitor the moods of others for signs of withdrawal. They play out scenarios in their head, not because they want to worry, but because they don't know how not to. This is not a flaw. This is adaptive behavior. The brain trying to protect from the unknown, the unpredictable, the unspoken. And yet the unknown remains. A test result, a partner's change of heart, a layoff, a diagnosis, a missed heartbeat, a world event that suddenly rearranges everything. Uncertainty is inevitable. And for the anxious woman, this is the hardest truth. Her anxiety whispers, you should have seen it coming. You should have been more prepared. You should have stayed one step ahead. But no one can live like that. Not fully. Not freely. And so anxiety grows, not because life is dangerous, but because control is impossible. Still, she tries. Some find control in routines, the same tea at night, the same route to work, the same clothes that feel safe. Some in information, reading every label, every article, every review. Some in relationships, people-pleasing, caretaking, being indispensable, not out of generosity alone, but out of fear. Some in the body, strict diets, rigid exercise, rituals that feel holy but may be cages. And when life disrupts these systems, as it inevitably does, the anxiety returns in waves. It may look like panic, or insomnia, or rage, or withdrawal, or a sudden numbness that feels like giving up. But underneath it always is the same cry. I don't know what will happen, and I'm not sure I'll survive it. This fear, though deeply private, is astonishingly common. Especially for women, who are often asked to hold everything, their families, their work, their emotions, the emotional needs of others, all while pretending they are fine. To surrender even a little control feels dangerous. And yet it is in the surrender that something begins to shift. Some anxious women learn this through therapy, some through illness, some through heartbreak that strips away all illusion, some through motherhood which defies every attempt at prediction, some through meditation, or faith, or simply exhaustion. They begin to see that control is not safety. It is a story we tell ourselves. The real safety lies elsewhere, in resilience, in presence, in the willingness to feel without fixing, to be seen without performing, to say I don't know what's coming, and I can still choose to stay soft. This kind of surrender is not passive, it is not giving up. It is the active, courageous decision to live with the unknown, and to stop punishing oneself for not predicting the future. Some women begin to trust themselves again, to believe they can handle change, to know that if the call comes, if the floor falls away, if the quiet is broken, they will shake, they will cry, they will fall apart, and still rise. Others take smaller steps. They leave an hour unscheduled. They turn off the phone, they say no without explaining, they pause the spiral, they allow themselves to not know, just for a moment. And in that moment they feel it. The world did not end. Uncertainty is still there, but so are they, not broken, not behind, not failing, just breathing, just living, just human. And that too is enough. There is a shadow that often walks behind anxiety, one that rarely speaks its name but touches everything it follows. Shame. In this 18th part of the story, we enter the quiet chamber where shame and anxiety meet, where they twine together like vines, indistinguishable, each feeding the other. Shame is not loud. It doesn't scream like panic or press like dread. It settles in the skin, in posture, in the soft slouch of a woman who feels she must apologize before she even speaks. Shame says, you are wrong, not just in what you do, but in what you are. And for the anxious woman, shame is often not separate from her anxiety. It is the anxiety, the dread of being found out, the fear of being seen too closely, the belief that her fear itself makes her unlovable. Let us sit beside her on a quiet morning. She has just come through another sleepless night. She scrolls her phone, sees someone jogging at sunrise, someone posting a neat desk with a caption, getting things done. She looks around her room, laundry undone, dishes in the sink, the weight in her chest still there. She thinks, why can't I just be normal? Why do I make everything so hard? Why am I like this? She may never say these words aloud. She may smile through meetings, crack jokes at dinner, keep her calendar full. But beneath the surface is the quiet pulse of self-blame. Not only am I anxious, I am wrong for being anxious. This is the voice of shame, and it has often been trained into her from the beginning. As a child, she may have been told she was too sensitive, that she cried too easily, that she overreacted, that her feelings were a burden. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of discomfort. Adults who did not know how to hold her bigness, her intensity, her tremble. So she learned to hide it, to make herself smaller, to smile through the shakiness, to apologize for her needs. And slowly, anxiety and shame became indistinguishable. Because now, when she feels fear, she doesn't just feel afraid. She feels ashamed for feeling afraid. She doesn't just feel anxious in crowds. She feels stupid for needing to leave early. She doesn't just panic before a presentation. She tells herself she's weak. She doesn't just fear abandonment. She tells herself she's clingy. She doesn't just need help. She tells herself she's a burden. And shame, unlike fear, doesn't come and go. It settles. It becomes a lens, a way of interpreting every stumble, every silence, every perceived rejection. A friend forgets to reply, and shame says, "You're not worth remembering." A partner sighs during an argument, and shame says, "You're too much again." A boss critiques a project, and shame says, "You're failing." They've finally seen it. This cycle is exhausting, because it turns every anxious episode into a referendum on self-worth. And the woman caught in it becomes an expert at hiding. She makes jokes before others can judge her. She downplays her symptoms to doctors. She erases herself in relationships. She becomes the helper, the listener, the fixer, not to manipulate, but to protect herself from being left. Because deep down, shame whispers, if they really saw you, all of you, they would leave. But shame lies, quietly, convincingly, pervasively. It distorts reality, and it keeps women from seeking the very thing that could free them, connection. Healing begins when shame is named, not exorcised in a moment, but witnessed, spoken, held in safe hands. Some women find this in therapy. The first time they say, "I'm scared all the time," and the therapist doesn't flinch. Some find it in friendship. The moment they say, "I think I'm broken," and the friend replies, "I feel that way too." Some find it in books, in poems, in characters who tremble like they do. Some find it in solitude, in a walk where, for once, the voice of judgment goes quiet and they can hear their own heart again. Shame begins to lose power when it is no longer a secret. When a woman can say, "I'm anxious and that doesn't make me bad. I struggle and that doesn't make me weak. I have needs and that doesn't make me selfish." And when she begins to believe these things, not just know them intellectually, but feel them, something changes. The tightness eases, the inner critic softens, the compulsive apologies lessen, the shoulders lift slightly. She may still feel fear, she may still overthink, but she no longer adds punishment to pain. This is not an overnight transformation. It is slow, tender, and deeply brave. Because shame does not vanish, it lingers at the edges. But now, she sees it for what it is, a shadow, not a truth. And when it speaks, she no longer bows to it. She places a hand over her heart, not to silence it, but to listen. And she says, "Even now I am worthy. Even now I am whole." There is a threshold that every anxious woman encounters at some point in her life. A quiet yet profound boundary where the personal becomes political. In this 19th part of the story, we step into that threshold, into the world of systems and structures, and explore how a woman's anxiety is not only shaped by her inner life, but also by the outer world that names her, measures her, limits her. Because anxiety does not exist in a vacuum. It lives within context, and the world a woman walks through each day is far from neutral. Let us follow her as she walks into a public building, an office, a clinic, a courtroom, a school. She carries herself with care. She makes sure her voice is calm. She rehearses her words, not because she wants to, but because she must. Because in this space, her credibility is fragile. Her fear could be mistaken for hysteria, her silence for guilt, her passion for anger. She has learned this, not from books, but from life. And her anxiety is not irrational. It is informed. For many women, especially those marginalized by race, class, sexuality, or disability, anxiety is not simply a chemical imbalance or an inherited trait. It is the cumulative weight of navigating systems that were not built for their survival. A black woman's anxiety is shaped by microaggressions, by the unspoken need to be twice as prepared, twice as calm, twice as careful. A trans woman's anxiety is shaped by safety, the fear of walking alone, of being questioned, of being erased. An undocumented woman's anxiety is shaped by presence itself, the fear of being seen, of being asked for papers, of losing everything in a single knock. A disabled woman's anxiety is shaped by inaccessibility, by the stares no one sees, the stares she cannot avoid, the assumptions made in her silence. These fears are not imagined. They are real, measured, documented, and yet so often dismissed, because systems tend to pathologize the individual while ignoring the structure. A woman is told to meditate, to journal, to self-care her way to calm, while living in an economy that devalues her labor, a culture that polices her body, a society that punishes her boundaries. She is handed pills for her panic, but not paid family leave. She is praised for resilience, but given no protection. She is encouraged to speak her truth, but interrupted when she does, and so her anxiety becomes chronic, because the threat is chronic. She wakes every day knowing she must manage not just her emotions, but perceptions. How will she be read? Will she be believed? Will she be safe? Will she be heard? This is the anxiety of structural imbalance. It is not treated in therapy rooms alone. It is held in policy, in history, in bias both blatant and subtle. And for many women, this leads to a second layer of pain, the guilt of not being able to fix their own fear. The belief that if they were just stronger, more spiritual, more disciplined, they would not feel this way. But no amount of deep breathing can undo the tension of living in a world that constantly demands apology for existing. Still, some women begin to name what's happening. They say, "My anxiety is not weakness. It's a signal of oppression I've been taught to ignore. My dread is not dysfunction. It's a response to survival in a world that gaslights me. My exhaustion is not laziness. It's the weight of being hypervigilant in spaces that erase me." And in naming it, they begin to resist it, not by pretending it's not there, but by building lives that acknowledge it, honor it, and slowly transform the spaces that created it. Some become advocates. Some become teachers. Some become healers. Some become quiet disruptors, changing culture within families, within classrooms, within friend groups. They no longer internalize everything as personal. They ask better questions. What around me needs to change? Who benefits from my silence? What parts of my fear are mine and what parts were taught to me by someone else's agenda? This reframing does not cure anxiety, but it gives it meaning. It allows women to locate themselves in history, in context, in resistance. It turns their trembling into testimony. And suddenly, what was once shame becomes fuel. What was once private becomes collective. What was once isolating becomes connective. A woman shares her fear in a workshop and sees 20 heads nod. Another writes a post about her panic in medical settings and strangers say, "Me too." Another teaches her daughter that her voice is not too loud, it's just been stifled too long. This is not just healing, it is liberation. And liberation, while terrifying, brings with it something radical. The possibility of peace that does not depend on perfection. A peace that says, you are not broken, you are reacting. You are not alone, you are part of something larger. You do not have to carry this by yourself anymore. And from that peace, a new kind of power begins to grow. Not the power of domination, but the power of presence. To walk into a room, anxious, still trembling, and still say, "I belong here." Not because the world gave her permission, but because she no longer needs it, begun to live with it differently. Because time, as it turns out, was never the enemy. It was never the thief. It was the mirror, the quiet companion, the thread running through everything she had survived, everything she had held, and everything she still longed for. In the anxious woman's heart, the fear of time is not just about endings, it's about longing. The longing to make meaning. To not let life blur into a sequence of tasks and expectations. To stop and say, "I was here, I mattered," not just to others but to myself. This is not a selfish desire. It is sacred, and yet women are often taught to put it away, to trade their own unfolding for someone else's schedule, to deny the clock ticking not in their bodies but in their spirits. And so the anxiety comes. It comes as urgency, as irritation, as a quiet grief that appears while brushing teeth, folding clothes, driving home. It comes in questions like, is this all there is? What have I missed while trying to be everything for everyone? Who would I be if I stopped asking for permission? These questions haunt the edges of her day, but they are not here to break her. They are here to lead her back, to the parts of herself that are still waiting. The teenage version who used to write stories into spiral notebooks and never showed anyone. The young woman who once wanted to live by the sea, but stayed close to home because someone told her dreams like that was silly. The new mother who looked out the window while rocking her child, wondering what else she could become, and then buried the thought. They are still there, all of them. And when the anxiety about time rises, when it tightens her chest or makes her restless or wakes her at 3 a.m., it's often these past selves knocking softly, asking to be remembered. Because time is not just what passes. It's what accumulates, what waits for our return. Some women respond by reinventing. They change careers at 50. They leave marriages that no longer breathe. They publish their first poem at 70. They stop dyeing their hair. They stop explaining their joy. They stop apologizing for taking up space. Others respond more quietly. They begin taking long walks without headphones. They read old journals. They create boundaries. They light candles not for anyone else's comfort, but their own. They reclaim their mornings. They begin to live with time instead of racing against it. They start noticing the hours that feel nourishing and the ones that feel draining. They pay attention to how certain people speed them up in all the wrong ways, and how others slow them down, gently, into presence. And as they tune into this rhythm, something remarkable happens. The anxiety doesn't vanish, but it changes colour. It becomes less of a demand, and more of a question: what do I want from the time I still have? Who do I want to be at this hour of my life? And sometimes the answer is not a grand ambition. Sometimes the answer is, I want to breathe. I want to rest. I want to love someone without fear. I want to like myself when I'm alone. These are not small things. They are everything. The anxious woman, once afraid of wasting time, begins to understand that she was never meant to fill every moment. She was meant to feel it, to move through it with presence, to allow herself pauses, grief, wonder, joy, even regret has its place, not as punishment but as tenderness, as a reminder that she has always cared about meaning, even when she didn't know how to name it. And now, at this stage of her life, she can begin again. Not because she's behind, but because time is not linear. It's layered. It offers her this moment, and this one, and this one. Each breath a doorway. Each hour an invitation. Each morning a promise. You're not too late, you're right on time. And the anxious woman, for perhaps the first time, believes it. She smiles, not because the fear is gone, but because she no longer lets it run the clock. There is a certain kind of anxiety that does not announce itself with panic or racing thoughts or trembling hands. Instead, it arrives as a low hum, barely perceptible yet always present, in the quiet space between what is true and what is shown. In this 21st part of the story, we enter the realm of masks, the ones women wear to protect themselves, to belong, to perform normalcy in a world that rarely holds room for rawness. The anxious woman has worn many of these masks. She wears the competent professional, calm in meetings, quick with solutions, always prepared. No one sees the breath she holds between emails. She wears the good mother, patient, cheerful, generous, full of bedtime stories. No one sees the tears she cries in the laundry room, asking herself if she's ruining everything. She wears the stable friend, always available, never falling apart, the one others call during crisis. No one sees that she doesn't know whom she would call if roles were reversed. She even wears the relaxed woman, the one who laughs at her own quirks, who says, "I'm fine, just a little anxious," as if it's a joke, not a quiet storm. These masks are not deception. They are survival. Because the world has long made it unsafe for women to be too much, too vulnerable, too sad, too lost. So they shapeshift, they curate, they become fluent in the art of appearing okay. And over time, the performance becomes muscle memory. A woman may wake up and automatically adjust her face, her tone, her presence, not to deceive, but to prevent discomfort, to protect her role, to maintain a fragile balance between visibility and invisibility. But inside, she begins to disappear from herself. She forgets what it feels like to be held without holding it together. She forgets how to speak without editing. She forgets how to cry without apology. She forgets what she looks like without the mask. And that forgetting becomes its own kind of anxiety, the fear that no one knows the real her, and worse, that she doesn't either. Let us sit with her on a Sunday evening. The children are asleep. The work week is already creeping in. She opens her journal but doesn't write. She stares at the page, trying to access a voice that feels buried. What do I want? What do I feel? What is mine, and what is a performance I've worn for so long it became skin? These questions do not always yield answers, but they open something, a space, a breath, a truth too long silenced. In recent years, conversations around authenticity have grown louder. Be yourself, speak your truth, live unapologetically. But for the anxious woman, authenticity can feel dangerous. Unmasking can feel like exposure. Vulnerability, once punished or ignored, cannot be reclaimed overnight. And yet, the ache remains. To be seen fully, to be known deeply, to let anyone witness the soft animal of her fear and not look away. Some women take slow steps toward this truth. They begin by saying no, softly, then louder. They admit when they're tired. They stop laughing at jokes that make them uncomfortable. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding. They cry in front of people they trust. Then they trust a little more. Others remove their masks more drastically. They leave careers that felt like costumes. They let go of identities built to please. They speak truths at family tables that silence them for a moment and free them forever. These moments are not easy. The fear spikes, the body remembers this is what we were taught to avoid. But what follows is different than expected. Not exile, but closeness. Not judgment, but resonance. Not rejection, but recognition. Because when one woman unmasks, others exhale. They say, I feel that way too. They say, I thought I was the only one who pretended. They say, thank you for going first. And so the anxious woman learns that her fear was not proof of weakness, but of wisdom. Her vigilance was not vanity, but a response to being unseen for too long. And now she begins the quiet work of coming back to herself, of learning how to breathe without performance, of discovering that some people love her most when she isn't polished, of realizing that rest is possible even with the fear still humming. She may still wear masks from time to time, we all do, but now she knows they are masks, and she knows she can take them off. And in that knowing there is freedom. Not the freedom to be fearless, but the freedom to be real, even while afraid. There are seasons when the body becomes the keeper of all that the mind cannot carry, when it speaks in symptoms, aches, exhaustion, and tightness. In this 22nd part of the story, we return to the body, not as a source of beauty or performance, but as a container of memory, a vessel that holds both survival and the silent toll of anxiety over years, sometimes decades. For many women, the body is the first to feel what the soul has yet to name. Before they admit fear, their heart races. Before they cry, their throat closes. Before they slow down, their back seizes. Before they know something isn't right, their sleep fractures. This is not dramatization. It is physiology. The body is not a betrayer. It is a witness. Let us follow one woman through a seemingly ordinary week. She wakes each day more tired than the last. Her shoulders feel heavy, her jaw clenched by noon. She can't quite focus. Her digestion is off. A vague dizziness visits her in the afternoons. The doctor says all tests are normal. She goes home with multivitamins and vague advice. But inside, her body knows the truth. She is holding too much. She is holding years of saying yes when she meant no. She is holding the loss she never cried for. She is holding the tension of performing calm in rooms where she didn't feel safe. She is holding the 1,000 unspoken things that women carry in silence. And so her body speaks, not fluently, but insistently. Anxiety for many women does not knock at the front door. It leaks through the walls. It becomes migraines, chest tightness, fatigue so deep it mimics illness. It becomes racing thoughts that arrive the moment the room goes quiet. It becomes a low-level nausea that lingers just beneath appetite. It becomes chronic inflammation. It becomes pain that moves without logic. And when they seek help, the answers often return incomplete. Maybe it's stress. Maybe you need to relax more. Have you tried yoga? Are you sure it's not just hormonal? These words, even when well-meaning, become bricks in the wall between a woman and her body. She begins to question her own signals, to doubt the legitimacy of her experience. And still, her body does not lie. It slows her down when she won't stop. It hums with discomfort when she's in the wrong place. It floods with adrenaline when she's pretending to be fine. It aches when her truth has no voice. Some women learn to listen, eventually. Not because they have time, but because they have no choice. Burnout becomes immobility. Emotional fatigue becomes physical collapse. And in that stillness, something shifts. They begin to ask not only what is wrong with me, but what am I holding that no longer belongs here? That question becomes a threshold. For some, healing begins in therapy. For others, in the hands of a gentle practitioner. For others still, in movement, dancing, stretching, walking slowly through forests or city streets. Some begin by resting without guilt, by eating when they're hungry instead of when they should, by sitting without checking their phone, by breathing deeply, not to fix anything, but to remember that they can. The body doesn't need perfection. It needs presence. It needs water and warmth and sleep that is not interrupted by punishment. It needs space to grieve what was never named. It needs touch that asks nothing in return. It needs stillness sometimes. And sometimes it needs to run, to release, to sweat, to remember it is alive. And more than anything, it needs kindness. The anxious woman has often been taught to view her body as a problem to manage, a shape to perfect, a system to optimize. But what if she began to view it as a companion? What if every flutter, every ache, every knot in her stomach was not a flaw, but a signal? What if, instead of silencing the symptoms, she asked, "What are you trying to tell me?" Some days the body's answer is soft. You are tired. Other days it is fierce. This is not your path. And sometimes it simply says, "Please come back. I've missed you." To live with anxiety is to live in a body that feels unsafe, even in stillness. But healing does not mean the fear vanishes. It means the woman begins to feel that she no longer has to fear herself. She learns to tend, not to control, to soothe, not suppress, to trust, not tolerate. And in that trust, her body becomes not a battleground, but a home. Still trembling, still learning, still sacred. There is a kind of quiet yearning that threads its way through every stage of an anxious woman's life. The yearning not to be fixed, but to be understood. In this 23rd part of the story, we enter the most vulnerable space of all, the longing to be witnessed, not solved, not advised, just seen. Because so much of anxiety beneath the symptoms and spirals is rooted in disconnection. From self, from others, from the simple, aching desire to feel real in someone else's eyes. Let us visit a moment, seemingly small. A woman sits across from someone she loves, a partner, a friend, maybe a parent. She is trying to explain how she feels. Her voice is steady, but her hands are tight in her lap. She says, "I don't know why I feel this way." She says, "I can't make it stop." She says, "I know it doesn't make sense." She waits. And the other person, well-meaning, uncomfortable, responds with solutions. "Have you tried exercising more? You just need to stay busy. It's probably hormonal. Don't worry, it'll pass." And with each word, the woman drifts further away. Because in that moment, she didn't need an answer. She needed resonance, a nod, a silence that held space instead of filling it. A soft, "That sounds really hard, I'm here." The anxious woman has often been surrounded by people who love her, but do not know how to meet her in her vulnerability. Not because they lack care, but because they fear what they cannot control. They want her to feel better, quickly, quietly, neatly. But anxiety is not neat. It is not linear. It is not resolved in 3 steps or 2 weeks or a mindfulness app. It is not a math problem. It is an experience. And experiences need company more than they need correction. This is the deep hunger many anxious women carry, to be held in their rawness without being told they are overreacting, ungrateful, dramatic, unstable, to be allowed to bring their full, unfiltered truth into the room without fearing that it will make them unlovable. And yet, because they have so rarely been met that way, they begin to self-edit. They downplay, they dismiss, they become fluent in the language of "I'm fine." They put smiley faces in texts after confessing fear. They say, "Never mind, I'm just tired." They laugh as they say it's stupid, but before sharing something that matters deeply. And when that happens enough times, when their truth is minimized, misread, or mishandled, they begin to retreat. Not because they want solitude, but because solitude feels safer than misunderstanding. And still, the longing remains. To have someone look them in the eyes and not flinch. To have someone sit beside them during the spiral and not try to make it go away. To be asked, "What do you need right now?" instead of being told what to do. To hear, "You don't have to make sense. I believe you." These moments, when they happen, are transformative, because they do not just soothe anxiety, they heal the shame that clings to it, the shame that says you are too much, that says you are exhausting, that says if they knew the full truth, they'd leave. But when the full truth is shown, and someone stays, a new story begins. Some women find this presence in a therapist. Some find it in a partner who grew into gentleness. Some find it in a friend who has sat in their own darkness and learned not to fear it. Some find it in a support group, a poem, a voice on a podcast that says, "I've been there too." And others begin to offer it to themselves. They learn to listen to their own fear without rushing it away. They whisper, "It makes sense that you're scared." They put a hand on their own chest, not to silence the heart, but to say, "I'm with you." That too is witnessing. That too is love. Because love is not just soft words, it is presence. It is staying when things are uncomfortable. It is allowing someone to unravel without trying to stitch them back together immediately. It is trust, not in the absence of fear, but in the capacity to hold it. And so the anxious woman, slowly, cautiously, begins to believe that she doesn't have to hide anymore, that her feelings are not evidence of brokenness, that her thoughts do not disqualify her from belonging. That her needs are not too much, they are simply unmet truths asking to be seen, and in being seen she begins to return to her voice, to her tenderness, to her courage, to herself. There is a stillness that comes after the long storm, not silence, for the wind never truly disappears, but a softer rhythm, a breath that does not race, a heart that no longer startles at every sound. In this 24th and final part of our story, we arrive not at a conclusion but at a settling, a homecoming. The anxious woman, after years, lifetimes, centuries of trembling, does not become someone else. She becomes someone who can finally stay. This staying is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of acceptance. She no longer waits for a moment when she will be fixed. She no longer holds her breath for the version of herself who will never cry in public, never feel panic on airplanes, never second-guess her words. She no longer believes in the myth of total calm. Instead, she builds a life that makes room for the shaking. She learns that steadiness does not mean stillness. It means flexibility, the ability to sway without breaking, the grace to feel discomfort and still move forward. Some mornings, she still wakes with dread, but now she knows how to greet it. She stretches. She breathes. She does not curse her fear. She makes tea for it. She lets it sit beside her, small and trembling, no longer trying to exile it from her body. She understands now. The goal was never to eliminate anxiety. It was to disarm the shame around it. She forgives herself more easily now. For the days she cancels plans. For the nights she overthinks a single text. For the weeks she feels fragile. For the years she tried so hard to pretend. She sees the whole map now. How every version of herself was doing the best she could with the tools she had. She sees the girl who learned to read everyone's moods before her own. The teen who worried about every glance. The woman who built entire careers from the scaffolding of self-control. She thanks them. She blesses them, and she no longer needs them to run the show. Instead, she trusts the deeper rhythm that has begun to pulse beneath the surface. Not always steady, but present, true. Her relationships shift too. She no longer performs ease to make others comfortable. She speaks more plainly. She says things like, "That overwhelms me, and I need some time to process, and I'm struggling today." She attracts new people, those who meet her where she is. Not with fixes, but with gentleness. People who know how to sit in silence with her. People who don't flinch when she cries. People who love her in her entirety, not in her curation. She also begins to protect her peace, fiercely, not out of fear but out of respect. She chooses environments that nourish her nervous system. She says no without guilt. She releases the roles that once earned her approval but cost her herself, and her joy deepens. Not loud, performative joy, but a quiet, rooted kind. The kind that comes from being alone and feeling safe in her own skin, from reading slowly in the afternoon sun, from walking barefoot on cool ground, from laughing unexpectedly and realizing she did not hesitate first. She begins to trust in cycles, that fear will come and go, that energy will rise and fall, that clarity may blur but always returns. She no longer rushes her healing. She knows now that some wounds reopen before they close, that some years are for blooming and some are for rooting. She honors both, and in doing so she becomes a woman who no longer needs to be rescued, not because she is invulnerable, but because she knows how to hold herself. Her anxiety becomes not an enemy but a signal, a call to listen more closely, a nudge to return to what is essential. And what is essential? Slowness, compassion, truth, connection, stillness without silence, movement without fleeing, belonging without performance. She is no longer waiting to become someone else. She is here, as she is, with trembling hands that still write, with a racing heart that still loves, with a restless mind that now knows how to rest, with fear that no longer defines her, only reminds her, you are alive. This is not a happy ending, it is a real one. It is not a cure, it is a choice, to stay, to soften, to keep going, gently. Because the anxious woman is not broken, she is brave, and finally, she knows it.